They say a king who fears nothing is the most dangerous kind of man. King Drevenkale proved them wrong. He feared one thing, the truth that his empire was built on the bones of everyone who ever loved him. Tonight, beneath a blood moon, a woman would stand in his execution square and speak that truth aloud. She wouldn't beg. She wouldn't scream. And that terrified him more than any army ever could. Stick around until the end to see how a single act of defiance can crack open an empire, and drop your city name in the comments if you're watching this unfold with us. You won't believe where this goes. The execution square stank of old blood and fear. Drevenkale stood on the obsidian balcony above the courtyard, his black cloak barely moving in the hot wind that swept across Valoris. Below him, 10,000 citizens packed the square like cattle, their faces pale in the torchlight. The executioner's block sat center stage, dark wood stained so deep with years of death that no amount of scrubbing could bring back its original color. Tonight made 47. 47 executions since he'd taken the throne 8 years ago. 47 people who thought they could challenge his rule, spread sedition, or worse, show mercy to his enemies. The number didn't bother him. Numbers never did. What bothered him was the silence. They used to scream. In the early days, the condemned would wail and plead, would call out to gods and mothers and anyone who might listen. The crowds would jeer or weep depending on the crime. There was noise, chaos, emotion. Now there was just this dead quiet, broken only by the crackling of torches and the shuffle of feet. Fear had won. And winning, Draven had learned, could feel a lot like losing. Your Majesty. Lord Corvin appeared at his elbow, skeletal and precise in his gray robes. The Master of Whispers always moved like smoke, appearing wherever discomfort lived. The prisoner is ready. Draven didn't look at him. What was the crime? Sedition, Your Majesty. She was caught distributing pamphlets in the lower districts. Anti-crown propaganda. Calls for rebellion. She? A woman, yes. Celine Valeth. No family name of consequence. A scholar by her own account, though she worked in the textile quarter. A scholar distributing rebellion in the slums. Draven's voice came out flat. How original. Shall I signal the executioner? How old is she? Corvin paused. The question clearly wasn't in his script. 26, Your Majesty. Perhaps 27? Young. They were always young, the brave, stupid ones who thought passion could stop a sword. Draven turned from the balcony and walked back through the marble archway into the palace proper. His boots echoed against stone that had been laid 300 years before his birth, back when the empire was just a collection of warring clans. His ancestors had united them through marriage and murder, and he'd inherited both traditions. The throne room stretched out before him, vast and cold. Dozens of nobles lined the walls, dressed in their finest blacks and deep crime-overs, the colors of mourning and power. They didn't gather for executions because they enjoyed them. They gathered because absence would be noticed, and being noticed was the fastest way to end up on that block. Draven took his throne without ceremony. The seat was carved from a single piece of midnight stone, probably the most uncomfortable chair in the empire. His father had believed a king should never be too comfortable. His father had believed a lot of stupid things, but he'd gotten that one right. Bring her up, Draven said. The command rippled through the room. Guards moved, doors opened. She walked in. Not dragged, not carried. She walked, head high, hands bound in iron behind her back. Her dark hair fell loose around her shoulders, tangled and dirty from however many days she'd spent in the dungeons. Her dress was simple gray cloth, torn at the hem and stained with what might have been blood or mud or both. But her eyes were clear, sharp, angry. She looked at him like he was the one in chains. The guards forced her to her knees 10 feet from the throne. One of them tried to push her head down into a bow, but she resisted, neck rigid. The guard hit her between the shoulder blades with the butt of his spear. She grunted, but didn't bend. Enough, Draven said quietly. The guard stepped back. The throne room held its breath. Draven studied her. She studied him right back. No deference in her gaze, no fear in the set of her jaw. Just this calm, burning defiance that made something twist in his chest. Celine Valeth, he said, you've been convicted of sedition against the crown. The sentence is death. Do you have anything to say? Most of them begged at this point. Some cried. A few spit curses they didn't have the courage to back up. She did none of these things. Yeah, she said. Her voice was rough, probably from screaming during interrogation, or maybe just from thirst. I've got something to say. Then speak. She looked around the throne room at all the nobles in their expensive mourning clothes, at the guards with their polished armor, at the marble and gold and evidence of wealth built on the backs of people who'd never see the inside of this room. Then she looked back at him. You're already dead, she said. You just don't know it yet. Someone gasped. Probably Lord Heron, who gasped at everything. Draven leaned forward slightly. Explain. This empire, it's built on fear. You rule through terror, through executions and midnight arrests, and making sure everyone's too scared to breathe wrong. You think that makes you strong. She shook her head. It makes you weak. I've conquered 6 territories in 8 years, Draven said softly. I've crushed 4 rebellions. I've expanded Valoris further than any king in 3 generations. Explain to me how that's weakness. Because fear doesn't last. Her voice got stronger, louder. Fear is the foundation that crumbles. People only stay afraid until they get angry enough to stop caring whether they live or die. And you keep giving them reasons to be angry. So I should rule with kindness? With mercy? Draven couldn't keep the mockery out of his voice. Should I let traitors walk free? Should I ignore sedition and hope it goes away? I'm not saying you should be kind. Celine shifted on her knees, the chains rattling. I'm saying you should be smart. Fear is a tool, not a strategy. You've built an entire empire on temporary ground, and when it collapses, and it will collapse, you'll go down with it, alone, because you've made sure no one in this room actually gives a damn whether you live or die. The silence that followed was so complete Draven could hear his own heartbeat. She was right. The thought came unbidden, unwelcome, undeniable. Every person in this throne room would smile at his funeral. They'd mourn publicly and celebrate privately, and then immediately start tearing each other apart for the chance to sit in this uncomfortable chair. He had no friends here, no allies, just people held in place by threat of violence, waiting for the threat to end. You make an interesting point, Draven said finally. You're still going to die for it. I know. She smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. But I'll die knowing I'm right. What do you get to die knowing? That you had power? Congratulations. Every dictator in history had power. Most of them died badly. Draven stood. The movement was sudden enough that several nobles flinched. He walked down the 3 steps from his throne and crossed the distance between them until he stood directly in front of her. This close, he could see the bruise on her cheekbone, the cut above her eyebrow, the way her wrists were rubbed raw from the iron cuffs. What did you think would happen? He asked quietly. When you distributed those pamphlets, when you wrote those words against the crown, what did you think the outcome would be? I thought I'd get caught. She looked up at him, and there was something almost like peace in her expression. I thought I'd die, but I thought maybe someone would read what I wrote first. Maybe it would matter. Maybe one person would realize they don't have to accept this. Accept what? A king who rules like a tyrant and wonders why he's lonely. The words hit harder than they should have. Draven felt his jaw tighten, felt the anger rise hot and familiar. He could kill her right here, right now. One command and she'd bleed out on this marble floor, and everything would go back to normal. But normal was exactly what she'd just described. Normal was this empty throne room full of people who hated him. Normal was silence where there should be loyalty. Normal was power without purpose. Take her to the South Tower, Draven said. Every head in the room turned. Corvin materialized at his shoulder again, confusion cracking his usual mask of neutrality. Your Majesty? You heard me. The South Tower. Lock her in the upper chamber. But the execution is postponed. Draven turned to face his master of whispers. I want to speak with her further, privately. Make it happen. Corvin's thin lips pressed together. Of course, Your Majesty. The guards hauled Celine to her feet. She looked at Draven with something that might have been curiosity or might have been contempt. Hard to tell. This doesn't change anything, she said. I know, Draven replied. But you're right about one thing. I am smart, and smart men don't waste useful tools. I'm not your tool. Everyone's someone's tool. The only question is whether you know who's using you. They dragged her toward the side door. She didn't resist, but she didn't cooperate either, making them work for every step. As she passed him, she spoke again, voice low enough that only he could hear. "You're going to regret this." "I regret everything," Draven said. "One more won't matter." The South Tower hadn't been used in years. It sat on the eastern edge of the palace complex, far enough from the main buildings that screams wouldn't carry, but close enough that guards could reach it quickly if needed. Previous kings had used it for political prisoners, the kind you wanted alive but forgotten. Draven climbed the narrow stairs alone, having dismissed his guards at the base. The stone walls were damp with condensation, the air thick and still. By the time he reached the upper chamber, his cloak felt too heavy, the heat oppressive. The door was solid oak bound with iron. He pulled the bolt and stepped inside. Celine stood at the window, her back to him. They'd removed her chains but not given her fresh clothes. She still wore the torn gray dress, still had dried blood in her hair, but she stood straight, looking out at the city lights below like she owned the view. "Come to finish it in private?" she asked without turning. "If I wanted you dead, you'd be dead." "Then what do you want?" "Good question." Draven closed the door behind him and leaned against it, studying her silhouette against the window. What did he want? The smart answer was information. Find out who else was involved in her sedition, root out the conspiracy, eliminate the threat. But that wasn't why he'd brought her here. "Tell me about the pamphlets," he said instead. "Why?" "Humor me." She turned finally, arms crossed over her chest. In the candlelight, her features were sharp and tired, but there was still that fire in her eyes, that refusal to break. "They were about you," she said. "About how you've taken a kingdom that could have been great and turned it into a prison. About how every policy you've implemented makes the rich richer and the poor more desperate. About how your war campaigns are just excuses to steal resources from neighboring territories while your own people starve. My people aren't starving. The ones you see aren't. The ones in the lower districts. The ones in the factory quarters? They're one bad harvest from starvation, and you wouldn't know because you never leave this palace." "I leave the palace constantly. For war, for executions, for military parades." She took a step toward him. "When's the last time you walked through the textile district? When's the last time you talked to someone who wasn't nobility or military? When's the last time you saw how your empire actually functions?" Draven didn't answer because he couldn't remember. Years, probably. There was no point. The lower districts were managed by governors and overseers. His job was strategy, military dominance, keeping the empire strong. "I keep the empire safe," he said. "From what? The only enemies we have are the ones you've created by invading them." Celine moved closer, and he could smell the dungeon on her, sweat and stone and old fear. "You've turned Valoris into a war machine that feeds on its own population. We're not safe. We're just too terrified to admit we're trapped." "You're not terrified." "I was. For years I was terrified. Then I realized something." She stopped a few feet from him, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. "Being scared of death is just another kind of prison. Once you accept that you're going to die anyway, the fear stops mattering, and then you're free." That's a nice philosophy for someone in a cell. "I'm not in a cell. You brought me to a tower with a window and a bed and a view of the city. You postponed my execution. You're standing here talking to me like I'm a person instead of a criminal." She tilted her head. "Why?" "Because you're the first person in 8 years who's told me the truth." The thought came so clearly that Draven almost said it aloud. But he didn't. Instead, he pushed off from the door and walked to the small table against the wall where someone had left a pitcher of water and 2 cups. He poured both, drank one, then offered the other to Celine. She took it, but didn't drink, just held it, watching him. "You want to know the real reason I've conquered 6 territories?" Draven asked. "It's not about resources or power or any of the things your pamphlets claimed. It's about control. Every territory I conquer is one less place my enemies can gather strength. Every rebellion I crush is one less threat to the stability of the empire. I don't rule through fear because I enjoy it. I rule through fear because it works." "Until it doesn't." "Until it doesn't," he agreed. "But the alternative is weakness. The alternative is mercy, and mercy gets you killed." My father was merciful. He believed in diplomacy and compromise and treating people with respect. You know what happened to him? He died. He was assassinated by his own brother during a peace negotiation, poisoned at the treaty table while he was trying to prevent a war. And my uncle took the throne and ruled for exactly 6 months before 3 different factions tore him apart, fighting over succession. 60,000 people died in the civil war that followed. 60,000. Because my father was too weak to rule and too kind to see the knife coming. Draven set his cup down harder than he meant to. The sound echoed in the small chamber. I learned from that, he continued. I learned that kindness is a luxury kings can't afford, that mercy is just delayed execution, that the only way to keep an empire stable is to make sure everyone's more afraid of you than they are of chaos. Celine finally drank her water, then set the cup aside. When she spoke, her voice was softer but no less direct. Your father wasn't weak because he was kind. He was weak because he was naive. There's a difference. She moved to the window again, looking out at the city. You can rule without being a tyrant. You can have strength without fear, but it requires something you've never had. What's that? Trust. Draven laughed, sharp and bitter. Trust gets you killed faster than kindness. No. Blind trust gets you killed. Strategic trust, knowing who to rely on and why, that's what builds actual loyalty. Your father trusted everyone. You trust no one. Both approaches fail. And you think you know the right balance? I think I know that what you're doing isn't sustainable. She turned back to face him. You can execute every person who speaks against you, but you can't execute an idea. And the idea that you're a tyrant? That's spreading faster than you can kill it. Eventually, you'll run out of executioners before you run out of rebels. The worst part was that she was right. Draven had seen the numbers. Sedition arrests were up 40% in the last year. Underground pamphlets, whispered meetings, small acts of sabotage. They were increasing despite the executions, maybe because of them. Every death created a martyr. Every arrest created sympathy. He was losing the war of ideas while winning every military battle. So what would you do? Draven asked. If you were in my position, if you had this empire and all its enemies and all its problems, what would you do differently? Celine studied him for a long moment, like she was trying to decide if the question was genuine or a trap. I'd stop treating my people like subjects and start treating them like stakeholders, she said finally. I'd find the problems they actually care about, food prices, working conditions, corruption in the lower courts, and I'd fix those instead of launching another invasion. I'd show them that the crown isn't just about power, it's about service, and I'd surround myself with people who tell me the truth instead of people who tell me what I want to hear. I'm surrounded by advisors. You're surrounded by sycophants. There's a difference. Draven walked to the window and stood beside her. From this height, the city looked almost peaceful. Thousands of lights from homes and shops and taverns, all of them full of people who feared him. The thought used to bring satisfaction. Tonight, it just felt heavy. You're dangerous, he said quietly. I'm honest. Same thing, in my experience. Below them, the execution square was finally clearing out. The crowd dispersed slowly, like they weren't quite sure if the show was really over. The block sat empty, waiting for tomorrow's victim. There was always tomorrow's victim. I could still kill you, Draven said. Easily. Right now. I know. But I'm not going to. Why not? He turned to look at her directly. This close, he could see the intelligence in her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she held herself like she was ready for a fight, even when she was exhausted and unarmed. Because you're the first person in 8 years who's made me question anything, he said, and I'm either going to regret that curiosity or it's going to save my life. Haven't decided which yet. What happens now? Now you stay here, in this tower, under guard but alive, and you're going to help me understand what I'm missing. I'm not going to be your pet revolutionary. I'm not asking you to be. I'm asking you to be what you already are, someone who sees clearly, someone who isn't afraid to speak truth. Draven stepped back, putting distance between them before he did something stupid like trust her. You said my empire is built on fear. Fine. Show me what it should be built on instead. And if I refuse, then I'll execute you at dawn and find someone else who's brave enough to try. Celine laughed, and the sound was unexpected, genuine and a little bit wild. You're insane. You know that? Probably, but I'm the kind of insane that's kept an empire intact for 8 years. That counts for something. It counts for fear and bodies and a throne room full of people who hate you. Exactly. Draven moved toward the door. Which is why I need someone who's not afraid to tell me when I'm wrong. Someone who doesn't have anything to lose. Someone who's already accepted death. He pulled the door open, then paused, looking back at her. Get some rest. Tomorrow we'll start fixing the empire. Or destroying it. One of the two. Draven. It was the first time she'd used his name. Not your majesty, not the king, just his name, stripped of title and ceremony. He stopped. This doesn't make us allies, she said. I still think you're a tyrant. I still think your empire is rotten. Bringing me here doesn't change that. I know. So why are you really doing this? Draven considered lying. Considered giving her some strategic answer about intelligence gathering or understanding his enemies. But she'd asked for truth, and if he wanted truth in return, he'd have to offer it first. Because I'm tired, he said quietly. I'm tired of being right about everything and wrong about what matters. I'm tired of winning battles and losing the war. And I'm tired of ruling an empire where the only thing keeping me alive is the fact that everyone's too scared to kill me yet. That's not a good enough reason to trust me. It's the only reason I have. He left before she could respond, pulling the door closed behind him and sliding the bolt home. The guards at the base of the stairs snapped to attention as he descended, but he waved them off, not in the mood for ceremony. The walk back to his chambers took him through the portrait gallery, past paintings of every king who'd ruled Vialoris for the last 300 years. Strong men, weak men, conquerors and diplomats, and a few who'd been both. Every one of them dead now, their empires lasting only as long as their lifetimes before transforming into something else. What would his portrait show? Draven Kael, the Hollow King, who ruled through fear and died alone. The thought followed him to bed and stayed there long after he should have been asleep. 3 days passed. Draven spent them watching the Empire function without him. He canceled court sessions, postponed military reviews, and told Corvin to handle the daily petitions. Instead, he did something he hadn't done in years. He listened. Not to his advisors or his generals or the nobles who whispered in corners. He listened to the city itself. Stationed guards brought him reports from the lower districts. Merchants complained about tariffs. Factory workers spoke about conditions. Families talked about the price of bread and the cost of medicine and the fear of conscription taking their sons. Every report made Celine's words echo louder. On the 4th day, he returned to the South Tower. She was awake, sitting at the small desk by the window, writing on parchment someone had provided. She looked up as he entered, unsurprised. "You've been gathering information," she said. It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" "Because you're smart, and because that's what I would do." She set down her pen. "What did you learn?" "That you were right about more than I wanted to admit." Draven pulled the other chair over and sat across from her. Food prices have doubled in the lower districts in the last 18 months. Not because of scarcity, because merchants are hoarding grain to drive up costs and my tax collectors are looking the other way because they're being paid to. Corruption at the mid-level. Classic. And the factory conditions are worse than I thought. 16-hour days, unsafe equipment, workers are getting maimed and there's no compensation system because the factory owners claim the injuries are the workers' fault. So fix it. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. Celine leaned forward. You're the king. Issue an edict. Cap food prices. Regulate factory conditions. Prosecute corrupt officials. You have absolute power. Use it for something other than executions. And when the merchants rebel? When the factory owners refuse to comply? When half my court tries to undermine the reforms because it affects their profits? Then you remind them why they're afraid of you. Her smile was sharp. The fear you've cultivated? It doesn't have to be wasted on maintaining control. It can be redirected. Make them afraid of failing their people instead of afraid of challenging you. It was brilliant. It was dangerous. It was exactly the kind of thing that could either save the empire or tear it apart. There's a council meeting in 2 hours, Draven said. You're coming with me. What? You heard me? I'm bringing you to the council, in chains if necessary, but I'd prefer you walk in on your own. Celine stared at him. You're going to bring a convicted traitor into your inner council? I'm going to bring an advisor who isn't afraid to tell me the truth. What you're convicted of is irrelevant. They'll think you've lost your mind. They already think that. Might as well give them proof. Draven stood. 2 hours. There'll be a bath drawn and clothes provided. Wear whatever you want, but be ready. He was halfway to the door when she spoke again. Draven. He turned. This is either the smartest thing you've ever done, she said slowly, or the stupidest, and I genuinely don't know which. Welcome to my life, Draven said. Neither do I. The council chamber erupted the moment Celine walked in. Lord Corvin stood so quickly his chair fell backward. General Thane's hand went to his sword. Lady Maris actually gasped loud enough to be heard over the chaos. Every noble in the room stared like Draven had just brought a wolf into a sheep pen, which, to be fair, he had. Celine walked 3 steps behind him, wearing a simple black dress that someone had found in the palace stores. Her hair was clean and pulled back. The bruises on her face had faded to yellow-green. She looked every inch a scholar and nothing like a prisoner. Draven took his seat at the head of the long table and gestured for Celine to take the empty chair to his right, the seat traditionally reserved for the queen or the heir apparent. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Your Majesty, Corvin started. This is Celine Valeth, Draven interrupted. She'll be joining our councils as an advisor on matters of domestic policy and civilian concerns. Her perspective has proven valuable, and I've granted her provisional pardon in exchange for service. She's a convicted traitor. Lord Heron's face was purple. She distributed seditious materials. She called for your death. She called for reform, Draven corrected. And she was right about most of it, which is more than I can say for this council in the last year. The silence that followed was dangerous. Draven could see calculations happening behind every pair of eyes. Who would challenge this? Who would stay silent? Who would try to use it as leverage later? General Thane spoke first, his voice measured. Your Majesty, with respect, bringing an enemy into our strategic discussion seems unwise. She's not an enemy. She's a critic. There's a difference. Draven looked around the table. And since when did this council become afraid of criticism? Since the criticism comes from someone who wanted to see you overthrown, Lady Maris said coldly. Celine finally spoke, her voice cutting through the tension. I wanted to see the empire reformed. There's a difference. If I'd wanted the king dead, there were easier ways than pamphlets. Is that a threat? Corvin asked. It's a fact. If you think distributing literature is the most dangerous thing your enemies could do, you're already losing. Draven watched the reaction ripple through the room. Anger, fear, grudging respect. Celine had walked into the lion's den and immediately established that she wasn't prey. Enough, Draven said. We have actual business to discuss. The grain situation in the lower districts has reached crisis point. Prices have doubled. People are going hungry while merchants hoard supplies. I want solutions. Lord Corvin recovered first. Your Majesty, the grain market is regulated by supply and demand. If we interfere, we're not interfering, we're governing. Draven cut him off. Lady Maris, you oversee trade policy. What's being done? The merchants have the right to set their own prices, Your Majesty. It's written into the commercial charters your father signed. Then we rewrite the charters. The room went silent again. Your Majesty. Corvin's voice was very careful. Rewriting the commercial charters would require unanimous council approval and would likely trigger resistance from the merchant guilds. They provide significant tax revenue. Antagonizing them could what? Draven leaned forward. Could make them angry? Could make them rebel? They're already getting rich while my people starve. I'd rather have them angry and regulated than happy and untouchable. The guilds have private armies, General Thane said quietly. Small ones, but well-trained. If they unified in opposition, then we'd crush them. Draven's voice went cold. I've crushed larger rebellions with worse odds. The merchant guilds don't scare me. Celine cleared her throat softly. Every head turned to her. If I may, she said, and the politeness was obviously an effort. You don't need to crush them. You just need to divide them. Explain, Draven said. The merchant guilds aren't unified. They compete with each other constantly. What if instead of imposing price caps across the board, you offered incentives to any guild that voluntarily lowers prices? Tax breaks, preferred trade routes, royal contracts. She looked around the table. The guilds that cooperate get rewarded. The ones that don't get isolated. Eventually, the holdouts either comply or get pushed out by their own competition. Lord Corvin frowned. That could work, but it would require careful negotiation. We'd need to move fast, Celine interrupted, before they have time to organize resistance. Start with the largest guild. Make them an offer they'd be fools to refuse. Once one major player cooperates, the others will follow rather than lose market share. General Thane was nodding slowly. It's a sound strategy, divide and conquer through incentive rather than force. It's also, Lady Maris said icily, the exact kind of manipulation that got us into this mess in the first place. We're just shifting who benefits. Yes, Celine agreed. But this time, the people who benefit include the civilians who need affordable food. That's the point. Draven watched the dynamic shift. His council was actually listening to her. Not because they liked her, the hostility was still thick in the air, but because her ideas made sense. She spoke their language, strategy, manipulation, power dynamics, but she bent them toward different ends. We'll implement it, Draven said. Corvin, draft the offers. Thane, prepare contingencies in case the guilds do organize resistance. Maris, I want a full audit of trade revenues so we know exactly what we're bargaining with. We move on this within the week. Your Majesty, Heron started. Was there something unclear about my orders, Lord Heron? The older man's mouth snapped shut. Around the table, nobles shifted in their seats, recalculating positions, adjusting strategies. Draven had just demonstrated that Celine wasn't decoration. She was functional, useful, and that made her dangerous in entirely new ways. The rest of the meeting proceeded in tense efficiency. Factory regulations were discussed. Tax reform proposals were reviewed. By the time Draven dismissed the council 2 hours later, 3 major policy initiatives were underway, all of them shaped by Celine's input. The nobles filed out in silence, shooting glances back at the woman who'd somehow gone from condemned prisoner to royal advisor in less than a week. Only Corvin lingered, waiting until the room cleared before approaching the head of the table. Your Majesty, he said quietly, I need to express my concerns about this arrangement. Express away. She's unvetted, untested. We know nothing about her loyalties or her long-term intentions. Bringing her into strategic discussions could compromise. Could compromise what? Draven stood, gathering the maps and documents scattered across the table. We've been having these same discussions for years, Corvin. Same arguments, same solutions, same failures. She's been here for 4 hours and she's already proposed more useful reforms than this council has in the last 6 months. She's also a convicted traitor. She's a woman who told the truth and got arrested for it. There's a difference. Corvin's jaw tightened. Your Majesty, I have served this crown for 20 years. I have never questioned your judgment, but this is different, I know. Draven looked at his master of whispers, at the genuine concern in his eyes. Corvin was loyal, competent, and completely unable to see beyond the system he'd spent 2 decades maintaining. Things are going to change, Corvin. The Empire is breaking, and we can either adapt or go down with it. Celine sees what we've been too comfortable to notice. That makes her valuable. It also makes her dangerous. Good. I need dangerous right now. Comfortable is what's killing us. Draven left before Corvin could argue further. Celine had already gone, escorted back to the South Tower by guards who weren't quite sure how to treat a prisoner who just advised the King's Council. The hallways of the palace felt different now, like something had shifted beneath the surface. Draven couldn't tell if it was progress or disaster waiting to happen. Probably both. Midnight found him in the palace library, a room he rarely visited. But tonight he couldn't sleep, and the reports from the lower districts kept circling his mind. Celine's words kept circling louder. He found her there too, curled in one of the high-backed chairs near the fireplace, reading a book that looked older than the Empire itself. Can't sleep? He asked. She looked up, unsurprised to see him. Can you? Not recently. He moved to the chair across from her. The fire crackled between them, casting shadows that made the library feel intimate despite its size. What are you reading? History of the Grain Rebellions. Happened about 60 years ago. Farmers refused to sell to the crown because prices were too low. Crown tried to seize the harvest by force. Whole thing turned into a civil war that killed thousands. She closed the book. Sound familiar? We're not there yet. You're closer than you think. Draven stared into the fire. The council thinks I've lost my mind bringing you into policy discussions. Have you? Ask me in a month. If we're both still alive, maybe it was genius. If we're dead, definitely insane. Celine smiled slightly. I appreciate your optimism. I'm not optimistic. I'm desperate. There's a difference. She studied him across the firelight, and Draven felt the weight of her gaze like a physical thing. This woman who'd faced execution without flinching now looked at him like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Why are you really doing this? She asked quietly. And don't give me the strategic answer, the real one. Draven was quiet for a long moment. The honest answer was complicated, dangerous, but she'd asked for truth. Because I'm lonely, he said finally. I've spent 8 years surrounded by people and completely alone. Every conversation is a performance. Every relationship is transactional. I can't trust anyone because everyone wants something from me. Power, favor, or just to survive another day. And I realized that if I died tomorrow, no one would actually mourn me. They'd mourn the stability, the fear, the structure. But me, the person, I'd be forgotten before they finished building my tomb. Celine was very still. And then you stood in my throne room, Draven continued, and you looked at me like I was just a man making terrible choices instead of an untouchable king. You saw through all of it, the power, the fear, the performance, and you called me out on my failures, and it was the first genuine interaction I'd had in years. So you're keeping me around because I'm honest? I'm keeping you around because you're the only person in this empire who doesn't need anything from me. You've already accepted death. That means you're free in a way no one else is, and that freedom makes you dangerous and valuable in equal measure. Celine set her book aside and leaned forward, elbows on her knees. You know what I think? I'm sure you're going to tell me. I think you're not lonely because you're king. You're lonely because you've convinced yourself that vulnerability is weakness. You've built walls so high that no one can reach you, and then you're surprised when you end up isolated. Vulnerability gets you killed in this position. No. Blind trust gets you killed. Strategic vulnerability, letting the right people in at the right times, that's what builds actual alliances. She held his gaze. Your father failed because he trusted everyone. You're failing because you trust no one. The answer isn't at either extreme. And you think you're one of the right people. I think I'm the only person currently telling you the truth. Whether that makes me right or just reckless is still up for debate. Draven laughed, surprising himself. When was the last time he'd actually laughed about something real? You're definitely reckless, he said. Takes one to know one. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down. Draven felt something in his chest uncoil slightly. Not trust, not yet, but possibility. The first crack in the armor he'd spent 8 years building. The grain initiative was, he said eventually. You really think it'll work? If you move fast and don't blink, the merchants will test you. They'll push back, look for weakness, try to find leverage. You have to hold firm. I'm good at holding firm. I know, that's why this might actually succeed. Celine stood, stretching. I should get back before my guards think I've escaped. They're stationed outside. They know you're here. Right. Because this isn't weird at all. The king and the convicted traitor having midnight conversations in the library. This empire is built on weird. We might as well embrace it. She moved toward the door, then paused. Draven? Yeah? Thank you. For not killing me. For listening. For... She hesitated. For seeing past what I was convicted of to what I might actually be worth. Don't thank me yet. This might still get us both killed. At least it'll be interesting. She left, and Draven stayed by the fire until it burned to embers. The library felt too quiet after she was gone. He hadn't realized how much he'd gotten used to her presence, her voice, her challenges. It was dangerous, this growing dependency on her perspective, but danger was the only thing that felt real anymore. Cuts. The grain initiative launched 3 days later. Draven made the offer to the largest merchant guild personally, standing in their ostentatious headquarters while a dozen fat merchants tried to negotiate better terms. He shut them down systematically, making it clear that the offer was final and the window was closing. They agreed. Not because they wanted to, because Draven made it clear that resistance would be costly in ways that had nothing to do with money. Within a week, 3 other guilds had signed on. Within 2 weeks, grain prices in the lower districts had dropped by 30%. It wasn't enough yet, but it was progress. Visible, measurable progress. The factory reforms were harder. The owners had more political clout and deeper connections to the nobility. But Draven pushed through anyway, issuing edicts that regulated hours, required safety equipment, and established compensation protocols for injuries. The pushback was immediate and vicious. 2 factory owners tried to organize a work stoppage. Draven had them arrested for economic sabotage and their factories seized by the crown. He appointed new managers from the worker ranks and doubled wages for anyone who stayed on. The message was clear: cooperate or be replaced. Celine watched it all from her position at the council table, offering advice, spotting resistance before it organized, and helping Draven navigate the political complexities he'd always just smashed through before. She was brilliant, ruthless when needed, compassionate when it mattered, and Draven found himself relying on her perspective more every day. The council noticed, the court noticed, the whole empire noticed. Rumors spread fast. The king had taken a mistress. The king had gone mad. The king was being manipulated by a commoner. The theories multiplied, each more creative than the last. Draven ignored them all. He had more important problems, like the fact that General Malrek was missing 3 scheduled military reviews and his northern legions were moving without authorization. "It's starting," Celine said when Draven showed her the reports. They were in his war room now, maps spread across the table, markers showing troop movements. "The rebellion you were afraid of. Malrek's been loyal for 6 years. Malrek's been waiting for 6 years. You've been too strong to challenge directly. But now you're implementing reforms that threaten the power structure. Now you're showing what might be perceived as weakness." She moved a marker on the map. "He's going to make his move soon." "How soon?" "Weeks, maybe days. Depends on how quickly he can consolidate support." Draven studied the map. Malrek commanded 30,000 troops, all hardened veterans from the eastern campaigns. If he turned those forces against the capital— "We need to move first," Celine said, "before he's ready." "Move how? If I arrest him without proof, I'll confirm everyone's fears that I'm a paranoid tyrant. If I wait for proof, he might be at the gates. So don't arrest him. Promote him." Draven looked at her. "You want me to promote the man planning a rebellion? I want you to pull him into the capital under the guise of a military honor. Make it public. Make it grand. Surround him with ceremony and witnesses so he can't make a move without exposing himself. Then, while he's here, quietly arrest his lieutenants on corruption charges." She traced lines on the map. "You said 3 of his officers were involved in supply fraud last year? They were cleared. Reopen the investigation. Find evidence. It doesn't have to be perfect, just convincing enough to justify arrests. Once his command structure is fractured, Malrek either backs down or makes a desperate move that exposes his conspiracy." It was devious, brilliant, exactly the kind of political maneuvering Draven had never bothered with because he'd always had the military advantage. "You've done this before," he said. "I've read about it, studied it. Power dynamics are the same whether you're running an empire or organizing workers in a textile factory. You just need to understand what people actually want versus what they say they want. And what does Malrek want? Power. Recognition. To be seen as your equal instead of your general." Celine met his eyes. "He's been in your shadow for years, winning your battles, conquering your territories, and getting none of the glory. Now you're making reforms that threaten the military's influence. He sees an opening. Then I'll close it. Carefully. If you crush him too obviously, you create a martyr. But if you outmaneuver him, you demonstrate why you're still king." Draven was about to respond when the doors to the war room burst open. Lord Corvin rushed in, his usual composure shattered. "Your Majesty, we have a problem." "Only one?" Draven asked dryly. "An assassination attempt. Tonight. We intercepted a messenger carrying plans to poison you during tomorrow's state dinner. The poison was already in the palace." The temperature in the room dropped. Who sent it? Draven asked quietly. Corvin glanced at Celine, clearly uncomfortable sharing sensitive information in front of her. Tell me, Draven ordered. The messenger won't talk. But the poison originated from the eastern provinces, and the dinner tomorrow, General Malrek is the guest of honor. Celine and Draven exchanged looks. He's accelerating, she said. He knows we're getting suspicious. This is his move. Then we cancel the dinner, Corvin said. Increase security. Arrest anyone associated with the plot. Oh, no. Draven's voice cut through the panic. We go forward with the dinner exactly as planned. Your Majesty, that's suicide. It's bait. Draven turned to Celine. You said he needs to make a desperate move that exposes his conspiracy. Let him. We know about the poison now. We control the environment. Let him try. And if he succeeds? Corvin looked horrified. He won't. Because we'll be ready. Draven started issuing orders. Corvin, I want every dish tested, every servant vetted, every entrance watched. But make it subtle. I don't want Malrek knowing we're on to him. Your Majesty, do it. Corvin left, still protesting. Celine moved to the window, looking out at the city lights. This is incredibly risky, she said quietly. I know. If anything goes wrong, if there's a backup plan we don't know about, you could actually die tomorrow. I could die any day. At least this way I choose the battlefield. She turned to face him. In the lamplight, her features were serious, almost worried. When had that happened? When had she started caring whether he lived or died? I don't want you to die, she said. Why not? 2 weeks ago, you were ready to watch me executed. 2 weeks ago, I thought you were just a tyrant. Now I think you might actually be capable of change, of becoming something better than what you are. She stepped closer. And I think if you die tomorrow, all the progress we've made dies with you. The reforms get reversed. The empire goes back to exactly what it was. Your death would prove that change is impossible. So I have to live to prove you right? You have to live because this empire needs you. The real you, not the hollow king everyone fears. The man who actually gives a damn about whether his people starve. The words hit hard. Draven realized she was close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her eyes again, could smell whatever soap they'd given her, could count the heartbeats between them. If I survive tomorrow, he said quietly, things are going to get worse before they get better. Malrek won't be the only one. There'll be more attempts, more resistance. The old guard will fight every reform, and they'll use everything they have. I know. And you're still planning to help me? I'm still planning to try. She smiled slightly. I might be insane, but at least I'm consistent. Celine, hit. Whatever he was going to say was interrupted by Celine closing the distance between them and kissing him. It was brief, fierce, over before he could process it. She stepped back immediately, her expression unreadable. Just in case you die tomorrow, she said. So you know someone actually gave a damn. Then she walked out, leaving Draven standing alone in the war room with a map full of troop movements and a head full of chaos that had nothing to do with military strategy. He touched his lips, still feeling the pressure of hers. This was dangerous. More dangerous than the assassination attempt. More dangerous than any rebellion. Because somewhere in the last 2 weeks, Celine had stopped being a tool or an advisor or even just an interesting perspective. She'd become someone he couldn't afford to lose. And in his experience, caring about someone was the fastest way to get them killed. The state dinner began at sunset. The grand hall was magnificent, decorated with crimson banners and gold fixtures, long tables laden with food that could feed the lower districts for a month. Nobles dressed in their finest filled the seats, all of them aware that tonight was significant, but none of them quite sure why. General Malrek arrived in full military regalia, medals gleaming on his chest, sword at his hip. He was a massive man, scarred and hard, with eyes that had seen too many battles. When he approached the head table to bow before Draven, his smile was perfectly respectful and completely false. Your Majesty, you honor me with this celebration. You've earned it, General. Your service to the Empire is invaluable. Draven's voice was warm, public, and just as false. Please sit. Enjoy the evening. Malrek took his seat 3 places down from the king. Celine sat on Draven's immediate right, dressed in deep blue silk that made her look like she belonged in this room. The council had protested her presence at the dinner. Draven had ignored them. The first course arrived. Soup, delicate and aromatic. Draven watched Malrek from the corner of his eye. The general ate normally, not rushing, not hesitating. If he knew the poison had been discovered, he gave no sign. Second course. Roasted duck with herbs. More wine. Conversation flowing around the table, artificial and careful. Everyone performing their roles. Draven felt Celine's hand brush his under the table. A warning? Reassurance? He couldn't tell. Third course. The doors to the kitchen burst open. A servant stumbled out, clutching his throat, face turning purple. He collapsed before he reached the tables, convulsing once before going still. The hall erupted in screams and chaos. Draven stood slowly, deliberately. His guards rushed forward, forming a barrier around the head table. Nobles scrambled back from their food. General Malrek had gone very, very still. "Everyone calm," Draven's voice cut through the panic. "No one else eat or drink anything. Guards, seal the hall. No one leaves until we understand what happened." "Your Majesty." Lord Corvin appeared at his elbow. The servant. "He was tasting the main course before it was served to you. The poisoning was meant for me." "Yes, I'm aware." Draven looked directly at Malrek. The general's face had gone carefully blank. "It seems someone wants me dead. The question is who?" "Your Majesty, surely you don't suspect anyone here," Lady Maris started. "I suspect everyone, starting with those who had access to the kitchens." Draven descended from the platform, his guards following. He walked slowly toward Malrek, who stood to meet him. "General," Draven said quietly, "would you know anything about this?" "Your Majesty, I am shocked and appalled that anyone would search him." The guards moved fast. Malrek tried to reach for his sword, but 3 men were on him before the blade cleared its sheath. They found it in seconds. A vial of clear liquid tucked into his belt, hidden beneath his medals. The hall went silent. "That's not... I don't know how that got there." Malrek's composure cracked. "No?" Draven took the vial from the guard, held it up to the light. "This is Widow's Kiss, Eastern origin. Causes convulsions followed by paralysis. Untraceable if administered correctly." He looked at the general. "The same poison that killed the taster. The same poison that was supposed to kill me." "Your Majesty, I swear I had nothing to do with..." "Save it." Draven's voice was cold enough to frost glass. "You've been moving troops without authorization. Your officers have been meeting with known dissidents, and now we find the murder weapon on your person. The evidence is clear." Malrek's face went from denial to desperate calculation to, finally, rage. "You think you're so clever," he snarled. "You think these reforms make you strong? You're weak. You've let a commoner whore cloud your judgment." His eyes cut to Celine. "She's made you soft, and the Empire will tear itself apart because of it." Draven hit him. The punch was sudden, brutal, and perfectly aimed. Malrek staggered back, blood pouring from his broken nose. Guards seized him before he could retaliate. "The Empire tears itself apart because of men like you," Draven said quietly. "Men who value power over progress. Who'd rather rule ashes than share control." He stepped closer. "You had a choice, Malrek. You could have been part of the solution. Instead, you chose treason." "I chose survival. The old ways kept us strong. Your reforms will destroy everything we've built." "The old ways were already destroying us. You were just too blind to see it." Draven turned to his guards. "Take him to the black cells. Hold him until trial. And arrest anyone who's had contact with him in the last month. I want every conspirator found and questioned." As they dragged Malrek away, still shouting curses and threats, Draven addressed the hall. "Let this be a lesson," he said, voice carrying to every corner. "I welcome reforms. I welcome progress. I welcome challenge and debate and even criticism. What I will not tolerate is betrayal. What I will not forgive is putting personal ambition above the Empire." He paused. "Anyone else planning treason should reconsider, because I promise you, I am always 3 steps ahead." The nobles sat frozen, terrified to move, terrified to stay. Draven let them sit in that fear for a long moment before dismissing them. The hall cleared in minutes. Only Celine remained, still seated at the head table, watching him with unreadable eyes. Draven climbed back to the platform and collapsed into his chair. 3 steps ahead, Celine repeated. Was that true or bravado? Does it matter? Probably not. She poured him wine from an untainted bottle. You handled that well. You don't sound surprised. I'm not. You're good at this. The strategy, the performance, the brutal calculus. You've been doing it for 8 years. She slid the wine across. What surprises me is that you're also getting better at the other part. What other part? The part where you actually care whether it works. Draven drank the wine, then set the cup down harder than necessary. His hand was shaking slightly from adrenaline and rage and relief that he was still alive. Malrek was right about one thing, he said quietly. What's that? You have made me soft. 2 weeks ago, I would have killed him in the square before he could even attempt assassination. I would have crushed the conspiracy the moment I suspected it. Instead, I played games, political games, and I nearly died because of it. But you didn't die, you won. And you won in a way that demonstrates competence instead of just cruelty. Celine leaned forward. Malrek's arrest isn't just justice. It's a message. You're strong enough to see threats coming and smart enough to neutralize them without resorting to blanket paranoia. That's leadership, not softness. Tell that to the servant who died tasting my food. He died because Malrek is a traitor, not because you were merciful. She reached across the table, covering his shaking hand with hers. You can't prevent every casualty, but you can make sure they mean something. That servant's death exposed a conspiracy that would have killed thousands if Malrek had succeeded. Draven looked at their joined hands. Hers was steady, calloused from whatever work she'd done before becoming a revolutionary. His was still trembling, scarred from 8 years of violence. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. Rule through anything other than fear. Build something instead of just maintaining control. I've spent my entire reign preparing for war, and now you're asking me to prepare for peace. I'm not asking you to prepare for peace. I'm asking you to fight for something worth having. Celine's grip tightened. Fear worked when you needed raw stability, but you've got that now. The empire isn't falling apart. It's just ossified. And ossification kills as surely as chaos, just slower. So what do I do? You keep doing what you did tonight. You adapt. You outthink instead of just outfight. You trust the right people at the right times, and you accept that leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about being better than you were yesterday. The words settled into Draven's chest like a weight and a promise. He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. I'm glad you didn't die tonight, she said softly. I'm glad you kissed me earlier, even if it was just a hedge against my potential death. It wasn't just that. No? No. Celine smiled, tired and real. It was also because I've spent 2 weeks arguing with you and discovering that underneath the tyrant is a man who actually wants to do better. And that's... She hesitated. That's worth something. Worth dying for? Let's hope it doesn't come to that. They sat in silence, hands still joined, the empty hall echoing around them. Outside, the city sprawled beneath the stars, full of people who'd go to sleep tonight never knowing they'd almost lost their king. Draven thought about Malrek and the black cells, about the conspiracy that still needed rooting out, about all the fights yet to come. The empire wasn't fixed. Far from it. Tonight was just one battle in a much longer war. But for the first time in 8 years, he wasn't fighting alone. And that changed everything. The black cells were deep beneath the palace, carved into bedrock that predated the empire itself. Draven descended the narrow stairs alone, waving off the guards who tried to accompany him. Some conversations needed to happen in private. Malrek sat in the farthest cell, wrists chained to the wall, face swollen from where Draven had hit him. He looked up as the king approached, and his expression cycled through hatred and defiance before settling on weary resignation. Come to gloat? Malrek asked. Come to understand. Draven stopped just outside the bars. You served me for 6 years, Malrek, led my armies, won my wars. Why turn now? Why? Malrek laughed bitterly. Because I watched you throw away everything we'd built. The empire was strong, feared, respected, and then that woman whispered in your ear, and suddenly you're worried about grain prices and factory conditions while our enemies gather strength. Our enemies were always gathering strength. The difference is now our people might actually fight for us instead of against us. The people don't matter. They never have. Empires are built by the strong and maintained through power. Your father forgot that and it killed him. I thought you understood, but you're making the same mistake, and it's going to destroy everything. Draven studied the man who'd been his right hand, his general, his weapon, and saw, finally, what he'd missed. Malrek wasn't wrong out of malice. He was wrong out of fear. You're terrified, Draven said quietly. The reforms scare you because they require trust, and trust is a risk you're not willing to take. Better to rule through force because force is predictable, controllable. Force is what works. Force is what fails. Draven moved closer to the bars. I've been where you are, Malrek, believing that strength alone could hold an empire together. But strength without purpose is just violence, and violence without end is just chaos wearing a crown. Pretty words from a man who's about to execute me. I'm not going to execute you. Malrek's head snapped up. What? You're going to trial, public trial, where your conspiracy will be exposed and judged according to law. If you're found guilty, and you will be, you'll spend the rest of your life in these cells, but I'm not going to give you the easy martyrdom of a quick death. Draven leaned against the bars. You're going to live long enough to watch the Empire thrive under the very reforms you thought would destroy it, and you're going to die knowing you were wrong. The hatred in Malrek's eyes could have melted stone. She's poisoned you, he whispered. That woman. She's turned you into something weak and sentimental, and when she's done with you, when she's gotten everything she wants, she'll destroy you from the inside. Maybe, or maybe she's the only person brave enough to help me become something other than a hollow king sitting on a throne of corpses. Draven turned to leave. They'll never accept her, Malrek called after him. The nobles, the court, the people. They'll never accept a commoner at your side. She'll always be the traitor you pardoned, the upstart you elevated. They'll hate her, and that hatred will bleed onto you. Then I'll deal with it. How? By killing everyone who objects? By forcing acceptance through fear? You can't reform your way out of that kind of resistance. Draven paused at the base of the stairs, looking back. Watch me. He climbed back to the surface, leaving Malrek's shouts echoing in the darkness behind him. Batwex. Celine was waiting in his chambers. She'd changed out of the formal dinner dress into something simpler, and she stood at the window looking out at the city like she was memorizing it, like she thought she might not see it much longer. You shouldn't be here, Draven said, closing the door. I know, but I needed to talk to you, and I figured your chambers were the one place we could speak without half the court eavesdropping. About what? She turned to face him. About what happens next. Malrek's arrest was necessary, but it's going to trigger backlash. The military will be divided. The nobles who supported his conservative stance will feel threatened, and every enemy you've made in the last 2 weeks will see this as an opportunity to push back. I know. So what's the plan? Draven moved to the table where maps and reports lay scattered. We move fast. Promote officers loyal to the reforms. Arrest the conspirators before they can reorganize. Push through the remaining policy changes while everyone's off balance. We use the momentum. And me? Celine's voice was quiet. What happens to me in all of this? What do you mean? I mean, I'm the excuse Malrek used for his rebellion. The commoner whore who's corrupted the king. Every conservative in the Empire is going to point at me as evidence that you've lost control. She crossed her arms. I'm a liability now, Draven. Keeping me visible makes you look weak. I don't care how it looks. You have to care. That's the whole point of politics. Perception matters as much as reality. Draven slammed his hand on the table hard enough to make the maps jump. I didn't survive an assassination attempt just to start making decisions based on what makes me look strong to people whose opinions I don't value. You're here because you're useful, because you're right about things I'm wrong about, because you make me better at this than I was. And when being better stops being enough, when the pressure gets too much and you have to choose between me and the stability of the Empire, then I'll choose you. The words came out before he could stop them. Honest, reckless, dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with politics. Celine stared at him. You can't mean that. I do. Draven, you barely know me. We've known each other for 2 weeks. That's not enough time to... Yeah. It's enough time to know you're the first person in 8 years who's treated me like a human being instead of a throne. It's enough time to know I'd rather fail trying to build something real than succeed at maintaining this empty performance. He moved toward her. You asked why I'm really doing this. Here's the truth. Because for the first time since I took this crown, I actually want to wake up tomorrow. And that's because of you. Celine's composure cracked. He saw doubt and fear and something that might have been hope all warring in her expression. This is insane, she whispered. Probably. We're going to fail. The Empire, the reforms, us, all of it. The odds are overwhelming. I've faced worse odds. Not with this much to lose. Exactly. Draven stopped just in front of her, which is why it matters, why it's worth fighting for. Celine looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw the same isolation he'd felt for 8 years, the same desperate hope that maybe, finally, someone understood. If we do this, she said slowly, if we try to build something real in the middle of all this chaos, it's going to be the hardest thing either of us has ever done. I know. And it might kill us both. I know that too. And you still want to try? More than I've wanted anything in my life. She kissed him then. Not brief this time. Not cautious. She kissed him like she was drowning and he was air, and Draven responded with 8 years of loneliness finally finding an outlet. His hands tangled in her hair. Her fingers dug into his shoulders. And for those moments, the Empire and the conspiracies and the impossible task ahead all faded into background noise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Celine rested her forehead against his. We're going to regret this, she said. Probably. But we're doing it anyway? Absolutely. She laughed, shaky and real. Then I guess we're both insane. Good. Sane people never change anything important. They stood there in the lamplight, holding each other like the world outside might disappear if they let go. And maybe it would. Maybe they'd fail. Maybe the Empire would tear itself apart and take them with it. But for the first time in either of their lives, they weren't facing the darkness alone. And that made all the difference. Chig. 3 days later, the arrests began. Draven moved systematically through Malrek's network, pulling in officers and nobles and merchants who'd thrown their support behind the failed rebellion. Some confessed immediately. Others resisted until evidence was presented. A few still denied everything, even as they were dragged to cells. The Empire watched, waited, tried to figure out which way the wind was blowing. Celine advised through it all, helping identify connections Draven missed, spotting patterns in the conspiracy that might have gone unnoticed. She moved through the palace now with a kind of cautious authority. Not quite nobility, not quite prisoner, something new that didn't have a name yet. The court hated it. The council objected constantly, and Draven ignored them all. On the 4th day, a letter arrived. Lord Corvin brought it to the war room personally, his face grave. Your Majesty, this came from the eastern provinces. It's concerning. Draven took the letter. The seal was unfamiliar. Not one of the major houses, not military, not governmental. He broke it open and read. The words turned his blood cold. What is it? Celine asked, reading his expression. Draven handed her the letter silently, watched her face change as she read. To the Hollow King, your pet traitor has helped you root out one conspiracy. Congratulations. But did you really think Malrek was the only one who sees the truth? The empire you're trying to build will never survive because it's built on a lie your father told, a lie your family has protected for generations. And now that lie is going to destroy everything. The people you trust most are the ones who've betrayed you longest. Look closer at your own blood, Hollow King. The knife is already at your throat. You just don't see who's holding it. War is coming, not from outside, from within. And when it arrives, you'll finally understand what your father died protecting. Sweet dreams, a friend. Celine looked up, her face pale. This is a threat, a warning, or the truth. Draven took the letter back, reading it again. My father died in a treaty negotiation, poisoned by his brother. Everyone knows this. Everyone knows what they were told, but what if there's more to it? What if the assassination was about protecting some secret instead of just seizing power? What kind of secret could be worth killing a king? The kind that would destroy the empire if it came out. They looked at each other across the war room table, both thinking the same thing. Everything they thought they knew might be wrong. And if the letter was right, if there really was a deeper conspiracy buried in Draven's own bloodline, then Malrek's rebellion was just the opening move in a much larger game. A game they were already losing. The letter sat on the war room table like a coiled snake, its words still burning in Draven's mind hours after he'd first read them. He'd dismissed the guards, sent Corvin away with orders to trace the courier, and now stood alone with Celine in the lamplight while the city slept outside. Look closer at your own blood. His own blood. His family. The Kyle lineage that had ruled Vaeloris for 3 generations, each king more brutal than the last because brutality was what worked. What kept the empire from fracturing? What prevented the chaos that had consumed kingdoms before them? But what if that brutality was protecting something darker than just power? Celine paced the length of the room, her footsteps sharp against stone. She'd read the letter 5 times now, each reading making her movements more agitated. When she finally spoke, her voice was rough with exhaustion and something that might have been fear. Draven, this isn't just a threat. This is someone who knows your family history better than you do. Someone close. Close enough to know my father's death wasn't what everyone thinks. Close enough to know there's a secret worth killing for. She stopped pacing, turned to face him. The lamplight caught the tension in her jaw, the way her hands had curled into fists without her realizing. You need to find out what your father was protecting, what he died for. My father died because he was weak, because he trusted the wrong person, or because he was protecting information that would have destroyed the Empire if it came out. Celine moved to the table, planted her hands on the map like she could divine answers from the topography. What if the treaty negotiation was cover? What if your uncle didn't kill him for the throne? What if someone else orchestrated the whole thing to keep your father from revealing something? That's a lot of what-ifs built on one anonymous letter. One anonymous letter that accurately described Malrek's conspiracy before we'd even confirmed it existed. One letter that knows enough about palace politics to predict our next moves. Whoever sent this isn't guessing, Draven. They know. The certainty in her voice made something cold settle in his chest. Because she was right. The letter was too specific, too informed, too accurate to be random conspiracy theorizing. Someone inside the palace, someone with access to information that should have been buried with his father, was playing a game Draven didn't understand yet. And he hated not understanding. I need to see my father's personal effects, everything that was sealed after his death. Celine looked up sharply. You've never looked at them before? Never saw the point. Dead men's belongings don't rule empires. They might explain who's trying to destroy this one. Draven moved toward the door, then stopped. The royal vault where his father's things were kept sat deep in the palace catacombs, accessible only by the king and locked by a mechanism that required blood and key together. He'd received the key on his coronation day and hadn't touched it since. The thought of descending into those crypts, of confronting whatever his father had left behind, made his skin crawl in ways that battlefield carnage never had. But Celine was right. Answers lived in the past, and he'd been too focused on controlling the present to look back. Come with me, he said quietly. She crossed to him without hesitation, and they descended together into the darkness beneath the palace. The catacombs smelled of old stone and older death. Torches lined the walls at intervals too far apart, casting shadows that moved like living things. Draven led the way through passages he'd walked once, 8 years ago, when they'd laid his father to rest in the royal tomb. Back then he'd been numb with rage and grief, and the weight of a crown he wasn't ready for. Now he just felt cold. The vault door was solid iron, inscribed with runes older than the Empire. Draven pulled the key from inside his shirt where he'd worn it on a chain for 8 years, never once considering using it. The metal was warm from his body heat, almost alive in his palm. He pressed his thumb against the blood lock, felt the sharp sting as it pierced skin, watched his blood well up and disappear into the mechanism with a sound like thirsty earth drinking rain. The door opened with a groan that echoed through the catacombs. Inside, the vault was smaller than Draven remembered. Shelves lined the walls, holding artifacts and documents, and personal effects from every Kyle king going back to the founding. His father's section was marked with a bronze plaque. Aldrich Kyle, beloved ruler, mourned by all. Beloved. Mourned. The lies they told about dead men. Celine moved to the shelves, running her fingers over spines of journals and ledgers. What are we looking for? Anything that explains why someone would kill him to keep a secret. Anything that doesn't fit the official story. They searched in silence, broken only by the rustle of old paper and the occasional scrape of metal on stone. Draven found military records first. Campaign logs from territories his father had conquered before deciding diplomacy was preferable to war. Nothing unusual there, nothing that suggested secrets worth protecting. Then Celine's voice cut through the quiet. Draven, look at this. She held a leather journal, small and unremarkable except for the lock that sealed it shut. Not a standard lock. Something custom-made, intricate, designed to keep casual eyes from prying. Draven took it from her hands. The leather was worn smooth from handling, like his father had held this book constantly, worrying it the way some men worried prayer beads. He tried the lock. It didn't budge. Can you pick it? Celine pulled a thin wire from her hair, started working the mechanism. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, the kind that came from experience most nobles never acquired. Where did you learn that? You think I distributed revolutionary pamphlets without learning how to break into places first? She didn't look up from her work, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Growing up in the lower districts teaches you skills the academy doesn't cover. The lock clicked open. Celine handed the journal back and Draven opened it to the first page. His father's handwriting stared back at him, cramped and urgent, and nothing like the measured script he'd used in official documents. The words hit like a fist to the chest. If you're reading this, I'm dead. And if I'm dead, it means they found out what I discovered. What I was trying to fix before it destroyed everything. The Empire is built on a lie. Not a small lie. Not a political convenience. A foundational lie that makes everything we've built illegitimate. We are not the rightful rulers of Valoris. Draven stopped breathing. Read the words again. They didn't change. Celine was reading over his shoulder, close enough that he could feel her breath against his neck. Keep going, she whispered. Draven turned the page. 300 years ago, when Aldrich I united the clans and established the Kyle dynasty, he did so through a combination of marriage alliances and strategic violence. This is the story every child learns. The official history. But there was a 13th clan. One that's been erased from every record, every history, every official document. The Vale clan. They were the largest, the most powerful, and they held legitimate claim to rule by ancient blood right that predated the clan system itself. Aldrich I didn't defeat them in honorable combat. He murdered them, every man, woman, and child, burned their holdings, salted their lands, and then he rewrote history to erase evidence they'd ever existed. The Empire is built on genocide, on theft of birthright, on a lie so complete that 300 years later no one even remembers the truth, except the survivors. Because there were survivors, a handful who escaped the massacre and went underground, preserving their bloodline and their claim, waiting for the right moment to take back what was stolen. I discovered this by accident while researching trade routes in the Eastern Archives, found documents that survived the Purge, treaties signed with the Vale clan, records of their territorial holdings, proof that they existed and that their claim was legitimate. I tried to address it quietly, tried to find the surviving Vale descendants and negotiate some kind of settlement that would acknowledge the historical wrong without destroying the stability of the Empire. I thought if I could find them, reason with them, we could prevent war. I was wrong. They don't want negotiation. They want restoration, complete restoration. The throne returned to the rightful bloodline, and the Kale dynasty eliminated the same way we eliminated theirs. And they have allies. People inside the palace, inside my own family. People who believe the lie should stay buried even if it means more blood. I don't know who to trust anymore. My own brother looks at me with calculation in his eyes. My advisors whisper in corners. Someone close to me is feeding information to the Vale descendants, helping them position for a strike I can't predict or prevent. If you're reading this, it means they succeeded. I'm dead, probably poisoned during the treaty negotiation that was supposed to prevent open war. And you're sitting on a throne that belongs to someone else, ruling an empire built on the bones of the people who should have ruled it. I'm sorry. I tried to fix this, tried to find a way forward that didn't involve more death, more lies, more blood. But I failed. Now it's your burden, your choice. Do you perpetuate the lie to maintain stability, or do you risk everything to tell the truth? Choose carefully. The empire depends on it. And watch your family. The knife is always closer than you think. The journal ended there. No signature, no final wisdom, just those words hanging in the air like a death sentence. Draven closed the book slowly, his hands remarkably steady considering his entire world had just inverted. Everything he'd believed about his family, his legitimacy, his right to rule, all of it built on genocide and lies. His father murdered by people who had every justification for wanting revenge. His throne stolen 300 years ago from people whose descendants were still fighting to reclaim it. And somewhere in the palace, someone from his own bloodline was helping them. Celine's voice came from very far away. Draven. He didn't respond. Couldn't. The weight of it was too massive. Malrek's rebellion wasn't the real threat. The grain shortages and factory conditions weren't the real crisis. All of it was just noise obscuring the fundamental fact that everything he'd killed to protect, everything he'd built his identity around, was illegitimate from the ground up. Draven. She grabbed his arm, forced him to look at her. Stay with me. We'll figure this out. Figure out what? That I'm a fraud sitting on a stolen throne? That everyone who's ever challenged my right to rule was actually correct? He pulled away from her, pacing the small vault like a caged animal. My father tried to fix this quietly, and it got him killed. What makes you think I can do better? Because you're not trying to fix it quietly. Because you've already started dismantling the power structures that keep this lie buried. The reforms you're implementing? They threaten the old guard because they shift power away from the bloodline and toward the people. That's dangerous to anyone who wants to preserve the status quo. So what? I should keep reforming until the empire tears itself apart and then hand the pieces to whoever has the best claim to the throne? Or you use the reforms to build something worth ruling? Something that's legitimate not because of blood right, but because it actually serves the people it governs. Celine moved closer, her voice urgent. The empire your ancestor founded was built on genocide. Fine. You can't change that. But the empire you're building right now? That can be built on something better. You want me to legitimize a stolen throne by being a good king? I want you to make the question of legitimacy irrelevant. Make people loyal because you're effective, not because of who your great-great-grandfather murdered. Build an empire where birthright matters less than competence. It was a beautiful idea, impossibly naive and completely impractical, and the only path forward that didn't end in civil war or abdication. Draven looked at the journal in his hands, at his father's desperate handwriting, at the weight of 300 years of lies. Then he looked at Celine, at the woman who'd faced execution and come out the other side still believing change was possible. The knife is always closer than you think, he said quietly. My father wrote that, warning me about family. Then we find out who in your family is working against you, and we neutralize them before they can strike. How? I can't arrest my own bloodline without proof. Can't even investigate them without tipping our hand. So we set a trap. We let whoever's feeding information to the Vale descendants think they're winning, and we catch them in the act. Draven felt a smile tug at his mouth despite everything. You think like a revolutionary. I am a revolutionary. I'm just working from the inside now. They climbed back out of the catacombs together, the journal hidden inside Draven's coat. The palace above was silent, the pre-dawn hour when even the guards walked their routes half asleep. No one saw them emerge. No one knew what they'd discovered, and that gave them an advantage, however slim. In his chambers, Draven spread the journal open on his desk, while Celine poured them both wine from a bottle that definitely hadn't been poisoned because she'd watched it opened herself. They drank in silence, processing. Finally, Celine spoke. We need to identify every member of your extended family who has access to sensitive information. Anyone who could have known about your father's investigation. Anyone who would benefit from keeping the lie buried. That's half the palace. My uncle died fighting for the throne, but he had 3 sons who survived the Civil War. They're all in positions of power now. Then there's my father's sister, my Aunt Lyria, who runs the eastern provinces. Her children, my cousins from the southern branch. We're talking about dozens of people. Then we narrow it down. Who has motive? Who has opportunity? Who has the connections to contact Vile descendants without being noticed? Draven thought about the letter, the phrasing, the knowledge it demonstrated. Whoever wrote it knew about the secret bloodline, knew about the reforms, knew enough about palace dynamics to predict how he'd react. That required access to both historical records and current intelligence. My cousin Theron, he said slowly. He's the royal archivist, controls access to all historical documents. If anyone discovered what my father found, it would be him. Would he have motive to keep it hidden? His entire career is built on preserving the official history. If the truth came out, everything he spent his life protecting would be revealed as propaganda and lies. He'd be disgraced. Celine nodded. Who else? Aunt Lyria. She's been governor of the eastern provinces for 20 years. That's where my father found the documents. She would have known he was researching in her territory, could have known what he discovered, and the eastern provinces are where the Vale descendants would most likely be hiding. Remote, mountainous, easy to disappear into. Draven felt pieces clicking together. Not enough for proof yet, but enough for a pattern. If Lyria had discovered the Vale survivors in her territory, if she'd made contact with them, if she'd been feeding them information and helping them position for a restoration, she would have had to eliminate my father when he got too close to the truth, and she would have let her own brother take the fall for the assassination to keep suspicion off herself. The thought made him want to break something, his aunt, his family, the people who should have been loyal above all else. If this was true, if Lyria had orchestrated his father's death and spent 8 years positioning for his own downfall, then every family dinner had been a performance. Every letter of support had been a lie. Every conversation had been her assessing his weaknesses. He'd trusted her, as much as he trusted anyone. She'd supported his claim during the Civil War, had helped him consolidate power, had governed the eastern provinces with brutal efficiency that matched his own methods. She'd been one of the few family members he'd considered an ally, and if the theory was right, she'd been his enemy the entire time. We need proof, Celine said. We can't move against her based on speculation. Then we get proof. Draven stood, pacing. We send someone to the eastern provinces, someone she won't suspect, someone who can investigate without triggering her defenses. Who? Anyone you send will be noticed. Lyria has eyes everywhere in the east. Not everyone. Celine's voice got quiet. Send me. Draven stopped pacing. No. Why not? I'm nobody. A former prisoner you've elevated for reasons that make the court uncomfortable. If you send me east with some official task, inspecting factory conditions, surveying grain supplies, whatever excuse we invent, Lyria won't see me as a threat. She'll see me as exactly what the court thinks I am. A distraction. Your latest obsession, not worth worrying about. She'll kill you the moment you get too close to anything sensitive. Only if she thinks I'm looking for something sensitive. But I won't be. Not obviously. I'll do the official inspections. Ask the expected questions. Play the role of the king's naive advisor trying to prove herself. And while everyone's watching me stumble through public duties, I'll be gathering information about Vale activity in the region. It's too dangerous. Everything we're doing is dangerous. At least this way we get information we can actually use. Draven wanted to argue, wanted to refuse, wanted to keep her in the capital where he could protect her. But she was right. Sending anyone from his inner circle would alert Lyria immediately. Sending Celine looked like exactly the kind of impulsive decision a king compromised by personal feelings would make. It was perfect cover, and it put her directly in the path of a woman who'd already killed one king. How long? He asked, hating that he was agreeing to this. 2 weeks. Maybe 3. Enough time to establish credibility and investigate without rushing. Long enough that if I find something, I can verify it properly. And if you don't come back, then you'll know I found something worth killing me over. Celine crossed to him, took his hands. Her fingers were cold despite the wine. I'm not walking into this blind, Draven. I grew up learning how to be invisible, how to ask questions without seeming to, how to survive in places where one wrong word could get me killed. This is what I'm good at. You're good at a lot of things. Getting yourself killed doesn't need to be one of them. She smiled, sad and certain. If we don't do this, we're just waiting for whoever's working against you to make their next move. And they will. They'll use the Vale claim to undermine everything you're building. They'll turn the reforms into evidence that you're weak, and when the empire is fractured enough, they'll strike. Better to take the fight to them first. She was right. She was absolutely right. And Draven hated it. 2 weeks, he said. If I don't hear from you in 2 weeks, I'm coming after you with the full force of the military. Deal. They spent the rest of the night planning. Cover story. Official duties. coded messages she could send if she discovered something critical, contingencies if Lyria became suspicious. By the time dawn broke over the city, they had a plan that was either brilliant or suicidal. Probably both. Celine left his chambers as the palace began stirring, slipping out before servants could gossip about her presence. Draven watched her go and felt the weight of command settle heavier than it ever had before. He was sending someone he cared about into danger based on a theory built from an anonymous letter and his dead father's journal. If he was wrong, if this was paranoia instead of genuine threat, he was about to waste resources and credibility on a wild conspiracy chase. If he was right, he was about to discover that his entire family legacy was built on mass murder, and his aunt had killed his father to keep that secret buried. Either way, everything was about to change. 3 days later, Celine departed for the eastern provinces with an official delegation and enough ceremony to make it look legitimate. Draven stood on the palace balcony and watched her carriage disappear into the distance, surrounded by guards who had no idea the woman they were protecting was also investigating potential treason. Lord Corvin appeared at his elbow, silent as always. "Your Majesty, sending the Valith woman east seems impulsive." "It is impulsive. It's also necessary. May I ask what she's investigating?" "Grain supplies, factory conditions, the same reforms we're implementing in the capital." Corvin's expression suggested he didn't believe that for a second, but he was too well trained to press. "Very well, Your Majesty. Should I arrange for additional security?" "No. I want her to look exactly as vulnerable as she is. The moment we surround her with extra guards, we signal that she's important. She is important." Draven didn't answer because Corvin was right, and admitting it would be admitting too much. Instead, he changed the subject. "Any progress on tracing the anonymous letter?" "The courier was paid by a third party who was paid by a fourth party. The chain is deliberately obscured. Whoever sent it knows how to cover their tracks. Keep looking. I want to know who's playing games with my family history." Corvin bowed and disappeared, leaving Draven alone on the balcony with his thoughts and the city sprawling below. Somewhere out there, Celine was traveling toward answers or death or both. Somewhere in the palace, a traitor was feeding information to people who wanted his throne. Somewhere in his bloodline, the knife was getting closer. And Draven stood in the center of it all, trying to hold together an empire that was fracturing from foundations he'd never known were rotten. The next week passed in a blur of council meetings and military reviews and policy implementations that felt increasingly hollow. Every decision Draven made was shadowed by the question of legitimacy. Every order he gave came with the knowledge that his right to give it was built on genocide. He found himself returning to the catacombs at night, reading his father's journal over and over, looking for clues he'd missed. There were references to specific Vale descendants his father had tried to contact, names that meant nothing to Draven, but might mean everything if he could figure out who they were now. Descriptions of meetings that went wrong, of negotiations that collapsed, of increasing paranoia as his father realized someone close to him was sabotaging his attempts at reconciliation. One entry, dated 3 days before his father's death, stood out. "I know who it is now. Who's been working against me. The knowledge is almost worse than not knowing. Family should be sanctuary. Instead, it's the place where knives hide in plain sight. I've arranged to confront them tomorrow, before the treaty signing. If I can make them understand the stakes, maybe we can still prevent war. If not, well, at least I'll die knowing the truth." He died knowing the truth, and he'd taken that knowledge to his grave, leaving Draven to piece it together 8 years later from breadcrumbs and educated guesses. On the 8th day, a coded message arrived from Celine. Draven decoded it himself in his chambers, hands shaking slightly as he worked through the cipher they'd agreed on. When the words finally emerged, they confirmed his worst fears. Factory inspections proceeding as expected. Workers grateful for reforms. Local governance complicated. Eastern archives show significant gaps in historical records. Documents removed systematically over past 20 years. Someone's been sanitizing the historical evidence. Also, increased military presence in mountain regions. Patrols in areas that should be empty. Governor claims it's bandit suppression, but numbers don't match threat level. Something's being protected up there. We'll investigate further. Miss the council meetings. The wine's terrible here. Draven read the message 3 times, then burned it. The wine comment was code. It meant she'd encountered direct danger but couldn't specify details without compromising security. Someone was watching her closely enough that she had to be careful even in coded messages. 20 years of systematic record removal matched Lyria's tenure as governor. The military presence in the mountains suggested she was protecting something, or someone. If the Vale descendants were hiding in the eastern ranges, Lyria's patrols would keep them safe, while also keeping everyone else from discovering them. The pieces were coming together into a picture Draven didn't want to see. His aunt was a traitor, had been for decades, had killed his father to protect a secret alliance with the people who wanted to destroy the Kael dynasty. And now she was waiting for the right moment to strike, using Draven's own reforms as evidence that the empire was weak and ready for regime change. He needed Celine back, needed her perspective, needed someone he could trust to help him figure out the next move. But she was trapped in the east, surrounded by potential enemies, and every day she stayed increased the risk that Lyria would figure out what she was really investigating. On the 10th day, everything accelerated. Lord Corvin burst into the war room without ceremony, his face pale. "Your Majesty, we have a crisis. Define crisis." The eastern provinces. Governor Lyria has declared martial law. Claims there's been an uprising. Anti-reform insurgents attacking government buildings. She's requesting additional military support to suppress the rebellion. Draven felt ice spread through his chest. When? The declaration came this morning. Messengers arrived an hour ago. And Celine? No word, no message, nothing. The trap had closed. Lyria had made her move, and Celine was caught in the middle of it. The uprising was obviously fabricated, a pretext for military lockdown, and an excuse to eliminate anyone asking dangerous questions, like a royal advisor investigating historical records and mountain patrols. Draven forced himself to think past the panic. If Lyria had declared martial law, she was preparing for something bigger than just covering up Vale activity. This was the opening move in a larger play. Lock down the eastern provinces, consolidate military control. Then what? Corvin was still talking, running through logistics and troop movements. Draven cut him off. Deny the request for additional military support. Your Majesty, Lyria doesn't need more troops. This uprising is a fabrication. If we send reinforcements, we're just giving her a larger army to use when she makes her real move. If there really is an uprising and we don't send support, we'll be blamed for any casualties. There isn't an uprising. Trust me. Draven moved to the map, studying the eastern provinces. What forces does Lyria control directly? Approximately 15,000 regular military plus local militias that could add another 5,000 if mobilized. That's counting the mountain patrols you asked me to track. 20,000 troops loyal to a governor who might be preparing to declare independence or back a rival claimant to the throne. Not enough to take the capital by force, but enough to hold the eastern provinces indefinitely if she decided to rebel openly. Unless she wasn't planning to rebel openly. Unless the martial law was cover for moving those troops into position while claiming she was suppressing insurgents. Get them close to the capital without triggering alarms. Then strike fast before Draven could organize defense. He needed to know what Celine had discovered. Needed to know if she was safe or already dead. Needed to make decisions with incomplete information while the whole situation spiraled beyond control. Convene the full council, Draven said. Emergency session. Now. The council gathered within the hour, every member radiating anxiety. News of the Eastern crisis had spread through the palace faster than fire. Everyone wanted to know what the king would do, whether he'd support his aunt or suspect her, whether this was genuine uprising or political theater. Draven let them speculate for exactly 3 minutes before calling the room to order. Governor Lyria has declared martial law in the eastern provinces. She claims anti-reform insurgents are attacking government infrastructure. She's requested military reinforcement. We're going to discuss our response. Lord Heron spoke first, predictably. Your Majesty, we must support the governor, if there truly is an uprising. There isn't, Draven said flatly. This is a power play. Lyria is manufacturing crisis to consolidate control. That's a serious accusation, General Thane said carefully. Do you have evidence? I have timing. Draven stood, pacing the length of the table. The reforms we've implemented in the capital are working. Grain prices are down. Factory conditions are improving. Worker satisfaction is up. Why would the eastern provinces, which are receiving the same benefits, suddenly revolt? Perhaps the benefits haven't reached them yet, Lady Maris suggested. Perhaps local implementation has been poor and resentment has built. Or perhaps my aunt realizes that effective reforms threaten her personal power base and she's creating justification to resist them. Draven stopped at the head of the table. Either way, sending her additional troops would be catastrophically stupid. We'd be arming someone who might use those forces against us. Against us? Corvin's voice was sharp. Your Majesty, Governor Lyria is your family. She supported your claim during the Civil War. She's governed the East loyally for 2 decades. What possible reason would she have to turn against you now? Because the Empire is changing, because the reforms shift power away from regional governors and towards central administration. Because she knows that effective reform means less autonomy for her and more oversight from the capital. Draven met Corvin's eyes. And because I sent someone to investigate her activities, and that person disappeared right before martial law was declared. The room went silent. You sent someone? Thane asked. Who? Celine Vaelith. Under cover of official inspections, she was investigating historical irregularities and unusual military movements in the mountain regions. The traitor? Heron's voice climbed an octave. You sent the woman convicted of sedition to investigate your own family? I sent someone I trust to investigate potential treason. Yes, Your Majesty, this is madness. If Governor Lyria discovers you've been spying on her, she already knows. Why else would she declare martial law the exact week Celine was asking dangerous questions? Draven looked around the table. My aunt has been sanitizing historical records for 20 years. She's maintaining military patrols in regions that should be empty, and now she's locked down the entire Eastern Territory right when someone started investigating those anomalies. Either she's guilty of something, or she's the unluckiest governor in the Empire. What do you believe she's guilty of? Corvin asked quietly. Draven hesitated. The full truth about the Vale genocide and stolen legitimacy would shatter the Council's faith in the dynasty. But partial truth might be worse. It would raise questions he couldn't answer without revealing everything. He chose his words carefully. I believe my aunt has been in contact with elements that seek to destabilize the Empire. I believe she's been protecting them in exchange for promises of power after regime change. And I believe she killed my father when he discovered her treachery. The accusations hung in the air like smoke. Lord Heron looked like he might faint. General Thane's hand had moved to his sword hilt unconsciously. Lady Maris was calculating political ramifications so fast Draven could practically see her mind working. Corvin spoke into the silence. If this is true, if Governor Lyria truly is planning rebellion, then martial law is just the beginning. She'll move troops into position under cover of suppressing insurgents. Then she'll strike at the capital when we're unprepared. So we prepare, Draven said. Thane, I want the capital garrison at full readiness. Quietly. No public announcements that might trigger premature action. Position our forces to intercept any eastern advance. And the governor's request for reinforcements? Denied. We tell her we're maintaining strategic reserve in case the situation escalates. That gives us cover while we mobilize. This could start a civil war, Maris said flatly. It could. Or it could prevent one by showing strength before Lyria thinks we're weak enough to challenge. Draven returned to his seat. Either way, we're not sending troops that might be used against us. The council argued for another hour, but the decision was made. Draven would refuse reinforcements, would position forces defensively, would prepare for the possibility that his aunt was about to become his enemy. And somewhere in the east, Celine was either gathering evidence that would prove the theory correct, or already dead for getting too close to the truth. That night, Draven stood on the palace balcony and watched the eastern horizon like he could see across 300 miles of territory to where Celine was trapped. The not knowing was worse than any battlefield. In war, you could fight, could act, could do something other than wait while someone you cared about walked into knives you couldn't see. He thought about his father standing in this same spot, knowing family had betrayed him, preparing to confront them anyway, choosing truth over safety, dying for that choice. History was repeating in the worst possible way. A sound behind him made Draven turn. His cousin Theron stood in the doorway, looking uncomfortable. The royal archivist was a small man, nervous and precise, nothing like the warrior kings who usually ruled Valoris. But he'd survived the civil war by being useful, by controlling access to information that legitimized claims and delegitimized rivals. Your Majesty, I apologize for the intrusion. I heard about the Eastern Crisis and thought you might want to review historical precedents for managing regional uprisings. Draven studied him. Theron had been one of the names on his suspect list. Access to archives meant access to the records his father had discovered. If anyone knew about the Vale genocide, it would be the man whose job was preserving official history. Actually, Draven said slowly, there is something you could help with. Come in. Theron entered, carrying a leather case full of documents. He set them on a table near the balcony, sorting through pages with practiced efficiency. I pulled records from the last 3 regional conflicts. The patterns are consistent. Governors tend to overstate threats to justify increased autonomy. The Crown's typical response has been measured support, coupled with oversight to prevent. Do you know about this Vale clan? Draven interrupted. Theron froze. Just for a second, just long enough to confirm he knew exactly what Draven was talking about. Then his expression smoothed back into professional neutrality. I'm not familiar with that name, Your Majesty. Is it relevant to the current situation? It's relevant to everything. Draven moved closer. The Vale clan held legitimate claim to rule before my ancestor murdered them and rewrote history. My father discovered the truth. He was killed for it. And someone in this palace has been helping erase evidence of what really happened. Theron's face had gone pale. Your Majesty, I don't know what you've been told, but I've read my father's journal. I know about the genocide, about the stolen throne, about the surviving bloodline that wants restoration. Draven's voice was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute authority. What I don't know is who in my own family has been helping them, but I'm going to find out. The archivist's hands were shaking now. If this is about the missing documents from the Eastern Archives, I can explain, then explain. Because right now it looks like you've spent 20 years helping my aunt cover up treason. No! Theron stepped back. Your Majesty, I swear my loyalty is to the Crown. Whatever your father discovered, whatever Lyria is doing, I'm not part of it. But you know something. I know. Theron stopped, drew a breath, made a decision. I know that documents have been going missing from the archives for years. Records that predate the official founding of the Empire. Treaties, territorial agreements, bloodline documentation. I reported it to Governor Lyria as the ranking family member with historical authority. She told me to keep it quiet, said it was being investigated privately. And you didn't think to tell the actual king? You weren't king yet, and by the time you were, the pattern had been established. I was afraid. Of what? Of what would happen if I challenged a governor who had the power to make me disappear? Theron looked genuinely terrified now. Your Majesty, I'm a scholar, not a warrior, not a politician. I preserve records and stay out of palace politics. If I'd known Lyria was using me to cover up genuine treason, you would have what? Reported it? Stopped her? Draven felt anger rising but pushed it down. Anger wouldn't get him information. But you know something else, something you're not saying. Theron swallowed hard. 3 months ago, Lyria requested specific documents from the archives, bloodline records, treaties from the pre-unification era. I had to tell her those documents were missing. She didn't seem surprised. Instead, she asked me to falsify new documents to replace them. And did you? No. I refused. She made it very clear that refusal would have consequences, but I couldn't do it. Couldn't create false history to justify whatever she's planning. What do you think she's planning? Legitimization. If she's working with Vale descendants who have legitimate claim, she needs documentation to prove that claim publicly. The original documents are gone, destroyed during the genocide. But if I created new ones, backdated, official-looking, they could be presented as recently discovered evidence. Proof that the Kyle dynasty has no rightful claim and should be replaced. By Lyria? Or by her Vale allies? I don't know. Maybe both. Maybe she's negotiating to be the power behind the throne after restoration. Or maybe she believes she can claim descent from both bloodlines and unite the claims through marriage or treaty. It was exactly what Draven had feared. Not just rebellion, complete regime change backed by historical evidence that would convince the Empire the revolution was justified. Lyria wasn't planning to seize power through force. She was planning to prove Draven had never deserved it in the first place. And in the middle of all this, Celine was trapped in Lyria's territory, asking questions that would get her killed. "I need you to do something," Draven said. "Something dangerous." Theron looked like he might be sick. "What?" "I need you to contact Lyria. Tell her you've changed your mind, that you'll create the document she requested. Your Majesty, if I do that, I'll be confirming her conspiracy." "Exactly. You'll confirm it, and you'll buy me time to extract someone from the eastern provinces before Lyria moves to final action." Draven gripped Theron's shoulder. "I'm asking you to risk yourself for the Empire. For the truth. Can you do that?" The archivist was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "If it helps stop whatever she's planning." "Yes, I'll do it." "Good. Contact her tonight. Tell her you're ready to falsify the records, but you need specific details about what she wants the documents to prove. Make her give you information we can use against her. And if she suspects I'm working for you, then make it convincing. You're scared of me, terrified of what happens if you refuse. You'd rather help her than face my wrath. She'll believe that because it's mostly true." Theron left 20 minutes later, looking like a man walking to his execution. Maybe he was, but he was also the best chance Draven had to buy time and gather evidence. The next 3 days were the longest of Draven's life. Every hour without word from Celine made the possibilities darker. Every message from the east reported increased military movements and tighter lockdowns. Lyria was consolidating power, moving pieces into position, preparing for something that would reshape the empire. And then, on the third night, a messenger arrived at the palace gates. Not an official courier, a civilian, a woman wearing servant's clothes and carrying nothing but a sealed letter. Lord Corvin brought it to Draven personally, along with the woman who'd delivered it. She was young, terrified, and refused to speak except to say that a lady in the eastern provinces had paid her to deliver the message to the king, and no one else. Draven dismissed Corvin and opened the letter with hands that shook despite his best efforts. Celine's handwriting, rushed and messy, but definitely hers. "Draven, I found them. The Vale descendants. They're in the mountain fortress Lyria's been protecting. 3 generations worth, maybe 50 people total with legitimate bloodline claim. They have documents, proof of the genocide, proof of stolen territory, everything your father was afraid of. Lyria's been protecting them for years. Made a deal. When the time is right, she helps them take back the throne. They make her queen regent and give her the eastern provinces as personal domain. She's been waiting for you to weaken yourself with reforms, so the transition looks like natural regime change instead of violent coup. The uprising is fake, but the military buildup is real. She's planning to march on the capital within 2 weeks. Going to present the Vale claim publicly while her troops surround the city. Force you to either abdicate peacefully or fight a civil war you'll lose because half the kingdom will believe the Vale claim is legitimate. I can't get out. Lyria's locked down all travel, guards everywhere. But I needed you to know. The knife isn't just at your throat. It's been there for 8 years and you never saw it because it was held by family. If you get this, don't send troops east. That's what she's expecting. Instead, the letter ended there, torn off mid-sentence like Celine had been interrupted or run out of time. Draven read it 3 times, memorizing every word, looking for hidden meaning or coded instructions. But there was nothing, just the raw intelligence and the brutal truth. His aunt was coming for his throne. She had evidence that would make her claim look legitimate. And Celine was trapped behind enemy lines with no way out. The point of no return had arrived. Draven could retreat, could negotiate, could try to buy time or broker peace or find some compromise that avoided war. Or he could accept that his throne was stolen, his legitimacy was false, and the only way forward was through blood and honesty. He stood on the balcony, watching the eastern horizon where an army was preparing to march. Thought about his father trying to fix this quietly and dying for it. Thought about 300 years of lies and the people who'd suffered for them. Thought about Celine risking everything to bring him truth he didn't want but desperately needed, and made his choice. No more lies, no more hiding, no more pretending the throne was legitimate when it wasn't. If Lyria wanted to make this about truth and legitimacy, then truth and legitimacy would be the battlefield. And Draven was going to use the one weapon his aunt didn't expect. He was going to tell the Empire the truth himself. Draven called the council at dawn. Not the full court, Not the nobles who would panic and spread rumors before he could control the narrative. Just the inner circle. Corvin, Thane, Maris, the three people who held actual power in the Empire and whose support he'd need for what came next. They assembled in the war room looking confused and worried. Emergency sessions at sunrise usually meant invasion or assassination attempts. What they got instead was their king standing at the head of the table with a letter in his hand and devastation in his eyes. "I'm going to tell you something that will make you question everything you believe about this empire," Draven said without preamble. "And then I'm going to ask you to help me fix it." He told them about the journal, about the Veil genocide, about 300 years of lies and stolen legitimacy, about his father's attempt to reconcile and the family betrayal that killed him, about Lyria's conspiracy and the army marching toward the capital to restore what had been taken. He told them everything. The silence when he finished was absolute. Corvin looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Thane's face had gone carefully blank in the way soldiers did when processing impossible information. Maris just stared at him with an expression that might have been horror or calculation or both. "Lord Heron would have fainted by now," Maris said finally. Her voice was remarkably steady. "I assume that's why he's not here. He's not here because he'd spread this across the palace before noon and we'd have riots by sunset." Draven set the journal on the table. "But you three are different. You understand power. You understand that legitimacy is a story we tell ourselves to justify who rules and who obeys. And you understand that story is about to change whether we control it or not." "The Veil claim is legitimate," Corvin said quietly. It wasn't a question. "By blood right and historical precedent, yes. My ancestor committed genocide and rewrote history. Everything since then has been built on that lie." "So what's your plan?" Thane asked. "Abdicate? Fight? Try to negotiate with people who have every right to want us dead?" "I'm going to tell the Empire the truth." Draven moved to the map of Valor spread across the table. "Before Lyria can use it against me, before the vile descendants can frame this as righteous revolution, I'm going to stand in front of the people and admit what my family did. Admit the throne was stolen. Admit that everything we've believed about our right to rule is false." "That's political suicide," Maris said flatly. "It's honesty. And it's the only move Lyria won't expect. She's planning to present the truth as revelation. A scandal that delegitimizes my rule and justifies regime change. But if I reveal it first, if I own it completely, I control the narrative." "You control nothing," Corvin said. "The moment you admit the dynasty is illegitimate, you invite every ambitious noble and foreign power to challenge your claim. The Empire will tear itself apart." "The Empire is already tearing itself apart." Draven's voice was hard. "Lyria has 20,000 troops preparing to march. The Veil descendants have documentation that proves their claim. My own cousin has been helping cover up evidence for 2 decades. This conspiracy didn't start yesterday, and it won't end with silence. The only question is whether I meet it with lies or truth." "And if the truth destroys you?" Maris asked. "Then I'll be destroyed by something real instead of pretending I have legitimacy I don't deserve." Thane stood abruptly, pacing to the window. "You're gambling the entire empire on the hope that honesty will matter more than 300 years of tradition, that people will accept a king who admits his dynasty is built on genocide. That's not strategy. That's faith. It's survival." Draven joined him at the window, looking out at the city waking below. "The old way is dead. Fear worked for 8 years, but it's hollow now. Malrek's rebellion proved that. The Veil conspiracy proves it. Every challenge we face proves that ruling through threat alone isn't enough anymore. So I'm going to try something different." "What?" "Earning it." Draven turned back to the council. "I can't change history, can't undo the genocide or make the stolen throne legitimate. But I can build something worth ruling, something based on effectiveness instead of blood right. The reforms we've implemented are working. People have better lives now than they did a year ago. That's real. That matters. And if I can convince the Empire that good governance matters more than whose ancestor murdered whose 300 years ago, then maybe we survive this." "Pretty speech," Maris said. "But Lyria will have prettier ones. She'll have documents and witnesses and victims' descendants standing beside her while she calls you a tyrant sitting on stolen property. How do you counter that? By agreeing with her." Draven returned to the table. "Everything she says about the past is true. I'm not going to argue it. Instead, I'm going to argue that the past doesn't determine the future, that we can acknowledge historical crimes while building something better, that legitimacy isn't about bloodline anymore, it's about results. The council members exchanged looks. They were considering it, not agreeing, not yet, but considering whether this insane gamble might actually work. What about the Vale descendants? Thane asked. If you admit the claim is legitimate, why would they accept anything less than full restoration? Because full restoration means civil war, and civil war means thousands of dead citizens who had nothing to do with the genocide. Draven pulled Celine's letter from his coat. According to my source in the East, there are about 50 Vale descendants total, 50 people with legitimate claim versus an empire of millions. If they push for violent revolution, they're choosing revenge over the welfare of those millions. That's not justice. That's just different tyranny. Your source, Corvin said carefully. The Valeth woman. Yes. Who's currently trapped in Lyria's territory. Yes. And you trust her intelligence completely. I trust her more than anyone in this palace. Draven met Corvin's eyes. She risked everything to get me this information. She's in enemy territory right now because I sent her there. So yes, I trust her. Sentiment is dangerous in wartime, Maris observed. So is distrust. My father didn't trust the right people, and it got him killed. I'm not making that mistake. The discussion continued for another hour. Arguments about logistics and messaging and what exactly Draven would say when he stood before the Empire to admit his dynasty was built on lies. Thane wanted military contingencies in case the admission triggered immediate rebellion. Maris wanted economic safeguards to prevent market collapse. Corvin wanted political assurances from noble houses before any public announcement. Draven gave them what he could, promised coordination, promised that this wouldn't be reckless confession without strategy. But he also made clear the decision was final. The truth was coming out. The only question was how they managed the aftermath. By the time the council dispersed, dawn had become morning and the palace was fully awake. Servants moved through hallways, guards changed shifts, nobles gathered for breakfast and political maneuvering. Everything normal on the surface, while beneath it, the foundations of the empire prepared to crack. Draven returned to his chambers to find Theron waiting in the corridor, looking like he hadn't slept. Your Majesty, I contacted Governor Lyria as instructed. She responded. Already? She was expecting it, almost like she knew I'd change my mind. Theron handed over a sealed letter. She wants me to come to the eastern provinces personally. Says the documents need to be crafted carefully and she doesn't trust couriers with the details. It's a trap, obviously. But it's also an opportunity. If I go, I can see the Vale Fortress firsthand, can verify what your source reported, can gather evidence of the conspiracy that you can use publicly, or you can disappear into Lyria's dungeons and never be seen again. Theron swallowed hard. That's a risk, but if it helps you stop a civil war, it's worth taking. Draven studied the archivist. Small, scared, nothing like the warriors and politicians who usually survived palace intrigue, but he had courage. The quiet kind that showed up when needed despite every instinct screaming to run. Go, Draven said. But take a military escort, small enough to look like normal security, large enough to extract you if things go wrong. She'll know they're your men. Good. Let her know I'm not completely naive, just desperate enough to send someone anyway. Theron started to leave, then hesitated. Your Majesty, when you reveal the truth about the genocide, will you mention that some of us tried to preserve accurate history? That not everyone in the palace was complicit? Draven felt something almost like sympathy. You want credit for not actively lying? I want people to know that loyalty to truth still existed, even when it was dangerous. I'll make sure they know. Now go. And Theron, come back alive. We're going to need archivists who care about accuracy when this is over. The archivist left. Draven stood in his chambers and felt the weight of command pressing down like physical force. He'd just sent another person into danger. Another piece moved on a board where the rules kept changing and the opponent held most of the advantages. But sitting still meant losing by default, and Draven had spent 8 years learning that sometimes the only way forward was through the fire. 2 days later, the summons came. Not from Lyria, from the Vale descendants themselves. A messenger arrived under flag of truce carrying a letter sealed with a sigil Draven had only seen in his father's journal. The ancient mark of the Vale clan, blood and iron intertwined. The letter was direct. King Draven Kyle, we know what your father discovered. We know that Governor Lyria has been coordinating with you through intermediaries. We know you're preparing to address the historical crimes committed against our people. This is wise. But words alone will not satisfy 300 years of injustice. We propose a meeting. Neutral ground, you, us, and the truth that has been buried too long. Come alone to the eastern border fortress at Keth's Crossing in 5 days. Come prepared to discuss transition of power. Or come prepared to explain why stolen property should remain with thieves. Either way, come. The time for hiding is over. It was signed by someone calling themselves Kyle Vale. The name was deliberate provocation. Kyle, his family name, combined with Vale. A statement that the bloodlines had once been connected before genocide severed them. The letter could be legitimate, could be Lyria's trap disguised as peace offering, could be both. The only certainty was that ignoring it would make him look weak, and showing up could get him killed. Lord Corvin argued against it immediately. Your Majesty, this is obviously a trap. They want you isolated and vulnerable. Keth's Crossing is deep in territory Lyria controls. You'd be walking into enemy hands. Or I'd be showing strength by meeting them on their terms, Draven countered. If I refuse, I'm a coward hiding behind walls while challenging their claim. If I go, I demonstrate I'm not afraid of the truth. You can demonstrate courage by sending a representative. I can demonstrate cowardice by hiding behind intermediaries. No. If they want to discuss legitimacy and transition, I'll discuss it, face to face. General Thane looked pained. Your Majesty, even if the offer is genuine, you'd be negotiating from weakness. They hold territory, they hold evidence, and they hold moral high ground because the genocide actually happened. What leverage do you have? The fact that I'm willing to acknowledge it. Draven paced the war room. Every other king would deny it, would call them liars and conspirators and crush them with military force. I'm offering something different, recognition, acknowledgement, the possibility of justice without more bloodshed. They don't want possibility, Maris said quietly. They want restoration, and you can't give them that without giving up the throne. Then we'll negotiate what restoration looks like. Maybe it's financial compensation. Maybe it's official recognition of the genocide and public monuments to their ancestors. Maybe it's territory in the east where they can govern themselves. There are options between total restoration and total denial. You're assuming they're interested in options. I'm assuming they're interested in not dying in a civil war that kills thousands. Draven stopped pacing. Look, I know this is dangerous. I know it could be a trap. But the alternative is waiting here while Lyria marches and the Vale descendants claim moral authority. At least this way I'm taking initiative. The council argued. Draven overruled them. By sunset, plans were in motion. He would ride to Keth's Crossing with a small security detail. General Thane would position forces nearby but out of sight, close enough to respond if things went wrong, far enough to not look like military intimidation. And Corvin would prepare contingency messages to be sent to every noble house if Draven didn't return. Messages revealing the full truth about the genocide and urging unity regardless of who ruled. It was preparation for failure, for the possibility that he'd ride east and never come back. But it was also preparation for the kind of leadership his father had tried and failed to establish. Honest, direct, willing to face consequences. On the morning of the third day, before Draven could depart, a courier arrived from the eastern provinces. Theron's escort returned without Theron. The captain was wounded, bloody, and barely conscious. He'd ridden 3 days straight to bring warning. Draven met him in the palace courtyard while physicians worked to keep him alive. Your Majesty, ambush, they were waiting. Slowly, Draven commanded, What happened? We reached the eastern fortress. Governor Lyria received us formally. Took Theron to discuss the documents. Then guards turned on us. Killed my men. I barely escaped. The captain coughed blood. It's a trap, Your Majesty, all of it. The documents, the meeting, everything. Lyria knows you're coming to Keth's Crossing. She's planning something. Draven felt ice spread through his chest. How does she know? I don't... The captain's eyes rolled back. Physicians swarmed him, pulling Draven away while they worked to stabilize the wound. But the message was clear. Lyria knew about Keth's Crossing. Knew Draven was planning to meet the Vale descendants, which meant either she'd intercepted the original letter, or someone in the palace was feeding her information, or the Vale descendants themselves were working with her more closely than Celine had discovered. The trap within the trap. The conspiracy behind the conspiracy. Everything Draven thought he understood about the Eastern situation suddenly had another layer he couldn't see. Lord Corvin appeared at his shoulder. "Your Majesty, you cannot go to Keth's Crossing now. Not with confirmed intelligence that Lyria knows you're coming. She's always known I'd have to respond eventually. But now she's prepared. Whatever she's planning, riding into it blindly will get you killed. And canceling will make me look weak to the Vale descendants and every noble watching how I handle this crisis." Draven turned from the wounded captain. "I'm going, but we're changing the approach." "How?" "We're going to give Lyria exactly what she expects, then hit her with what she doesn't." Draven spent the next 18 hours planning. Not the kind of frontal strategy he'd used in military campaigns. Something more subtle, more political. The kind of maneuvering Celine would have appreciated if she'd been here to see it. He would go to Keth's Crossing as planned, would bring the small security detail and look like he was walking into the obvious trap. But General Thane would move forces into position not to defend Draven, but to cut off Lyria's supply lines and communication with the capital. While everyone's attention was focused on the meeting at the border, Thane would surround the eastern fortress and prepare to lay siege. If Lyria arrested Draven at Keth's Crossing, Thane would immediately blockade the east and demand his release. If she tried to use him as hostage, she'd discover her entire territory was surrounded and cut off from reinforcement. The leverage would shift from her to the crown. It was risky, dependent on timing and coordination and Lyria not predicting the counter-move. But it was better than riding into ambush with no plan beyond hoping for reasonable negotiation. On the 5th morning, Draven rode east. The journey took 3 days. 3 days of watching the landscape change from cultivated farmland to rough frontier territory. 3 days of thinking about Celine trapped somewhere ahead, about Theron captured or dead, about the Empire fracturing behind him while he rode toward people who had legitimate reason to want him dead. At night, camped in rough shelter, he read his father's journal again, looking for guidance, looking for some insight Aldrich had left behind about how to navigate impossible choices between truth and stability. One passage stood out, written in the final weeks before assassination. "I'm beginning to understand that there's no clean solution. No way to acknowledge the genocide without destabilizing the Empire. No way to make peace with the Vale descendants without admitting our entire claim is false. Every path forward requires sacrifice. The only question is what I'm willing to sacrifice. My crown, my family's legacy, my life, or my integrity. I know what my son would choose. He'd sacrifice everything else to keep the crown because that's what I've taught him. That power matters more than truth. I was wrong, and by the time he reads this, it will be too late to tell him." Draven closed the journal and stared into the campfire. His father had been wrong about what he'd choose. Wrong to assume Draven would pick power over truth. Or maybe not wrong. Maybe accurate based on who Draven had been before Celine challenged him to see beyond fear and control. But he wasn't that person anymore. Wasn't sure when the change had happened. Maybe in the throne room when Celine called him hollow. Maybe in the library when she kissed him. Maybe in the moment he decided sending her east was worth the risk because getting answers mattered more than keeping her safe. Somewhere along the way, he'd stopped being the Hollow King and started being something else. Something more dangerous because it actually cared about outcomes beyond just maintaining power. And that's what would either save the Empire or destroy it completely. Keth's Crossing appeared on the 4th day. A fortress built into the mountainside, ancient stone that had stood when the clans were still fighting each other for territory. It sat at the exact point where eastern provinces met crown lands, neutral ground, or as neutral as anywhere could be when armies were positioning for war. Draven approached with his small security detail. 20 men, enough to look legitimate, not enough to threaten anyone. The gates opened as they drew close, and a figure emerged to meet them. A woman. Tall, dark-haired, dressed in armor that bore no sigil or house colors. She stopped 20 paces from Draven's horse and looked up at him with eyes that held 300 years of anger. "King Draven Kale." Her voice was clear and cold. "I am Kale Vale, descendant of the bloodline your ancestor tried to erase." We should talk. Draven dismounted, felt every instinct screaming that this was dangerous, walking towards someone who had legitimate reason to want him dead. But he'd come this far. Retreat now would mean everything he'd risked. Celine's safety, Theron's mission, his own credibility was for nothing. They walked toward the fortress together. Draven's guards stayed with the horses. Inside, the fortress was sparsely furnished but well maintained. Someone had been using this place, preparing it. The walls held tapestries Draven didn't recognize, symbols from a history that had been erased but apparently not forgotten. Kyle Vial led him to a council room where 6 others waited, men and women ranging from elderly to young, all of them bearing the features that marked Vale bloodline according to his father's notes. Dark hair, sharp features, eyes like winter ice. "This is the king who sits on our throne," Kyle said to them. "The man whose family murdered ours and rewrote history to justify it." She turned back to Draven. "Are you here to deny it? To claim your right through conquest? Or are you finally ready to acknowledge what your dynasty is built on?" "I'm here to acknowledge the genocide," Draven said. "My ancestor committed atrocity, murdered your people, stole your claim. Everything you believe about historical injustice is true. I'm not going to argue it." The room went silent. They'd expected denial, expected him to fight. The admission clearly caught them off balance. An elderly man spoke next. His voice was rough with age and something that might have been surprise. "You admit it, just like that. Admit your dynasty has no legitimate claim." "I admit my dynasty's claim is built on genocide and lies." "Yes. Whether that makes it illegitimate depends on whether you believe blood right matters more than 300 years of established governance." "There is no established governance without legitimacy," Kale said sharply. "You rule through fear and force. Not consent, not rightful claim. You're a thief sitting on stolen property, and admitting it doesn't change the fact that the property should be returned. Returned to who?" Draven moved toward the table at the center of the room. "To 50 descendants of a clan that was destroyed 3 centuries ago? To people who've never governed anything larger than this fortress? You have legitimate historical claim. But claiming is different from ruling. We ruled before your family murdered us. Your ancestors ruled when the empire was fractured clans fighting endless wars. The Vale clan was powerful, yes, but it didn't unite the territories, didn't create lasting peace, didn't build what exists now." Draven placed his hands on the table. "I'm not saying my family's methods were right. The genocide was monstrous. But the empire that exists now serves millions of people. Destabilizing it for the sake of blood right serves no one. It serves justice," the elderly man said. "It serves revenge disguised as justice. Real justice would acknowledge the crime and make amends without punishing millions of current citizens who had nothing to do with what happened 300 years ago." Kale Vale's expression was hard. "You speak of amends. What amends could possibly address genocide? Official recognition, public acknowledgement of the crime, monuments to your ancestors, territory in the East where Vale descendants can govern autonomously, financial compensation, educational programs to ensure the true history is taught." Draven looked around the table. "I can't undo the past, but I can acknowledge it and build a future that's better than what my ancestors created." "And the throne?" Kyle asked. "Do you keep your stolen crown while offering us scraps of recognition?" "I keep the throne if I can prove I've earned it through effective governance. You challenge it if you can prove you do better. And we let the empire decide which matters more, whose ancestor killed whose, or who can actually rule well." A younger woman spoke up. "You ask us to accept symbolic gestures while you maintain real power. That's not justice. That's public relations. It's pragmatism." Draven straightened. "You want full restoration. I understand that. But full restoration means civil war, means thousands of deaths, means destroying the stability that millions of people depend on. I'm offering a different path, one where we acknowledge historical wrong while building something better for the future." The Vale descendants looked at each other, conferring silently. Draven watched their faces and tried to read whether any of this was landing or if he was just delaying the inevitable. Finally, Kyle spoke again. "Your offer is interesting, more than we expected from a Kyle king, but it's incomplete. Recognition means nothing without power. We want guaranteed seats on your council, want authority over eastern provinces, Want military positions and legal status that makes us partners in governance, not decorative victims you acknowledge at ceremonies. That's negotiable, and we want the truth told publicly, not just private acknowledgement. You stand before the empire and admit what your family did. Admit the throne was stolen. Let people decide if they still want to follow a dynasty built on genocide. I'm planning to do exactly that. Draven pulled his father's journal from his coat. My father tried to negotiate with you quietly, tried to fix this without destabilizing the empire. It got him killed. I'm not making that mistake. The truth is coming out whether it destroys me or not. He set the journal on the table between them. Kale picked it up, opened it, started reading. Her expression shifted as she processed Aldrich's words. The other descendants leaned in, reading over her shoulder. Your father, Kale said slowly, genuinely tried to make amends, tried to find us and negotiate. We didn't know. We were told he was just another Kyle tyrant looking to eliminate loose ends. Told by who? By Governor Lyria. She made contact with us years ago, said she'd discovered our existence and wanted to help restore our claim. Said your father was hunting us to finish what his ancestors started, and you believed her. We had 300 years of reasons to believe the Kyle dynasty wanted us dead. Kyle looked up from the journal. She showed us documents, records of your father's research into our bloodline, made it look like he was tracking us for elimination. Draven felt pieces clicking into place. The conspiracy was deeper than he'd realized. Lyria hadn't just allied with the Vale descendants. She'd manipulated them, had taken Aldrich's genuine attempts at reconciliation and twisted them into evidence of threat, had positioned herself as their ally while using them as weapons against the crown. And they'd believed her because the alternative, trusting a Kyle king, was impossible after 300 years of erasure. Everything Lyria told you was a lie, Draven said quietly. My father wasn't hunting you. He was trying to negotiate with you, trying to acknowledge the genocide and find a path forward that didn't require more death. She killed him to prevent that reconciliation, because peace between Kyle and Vile wouldn't serve her ambitions. How do we know you're telling the truth now? Because I have nothing to gain by lying. Draven gestured at the journal. Read it, all of it. See what my father actually wrote. See what he actually wanted. Then decide whether I'm here in good faith or just repeating his manipulation. The Vale descendants passed the journal around. Reading, processing. Draven watched their faces change as they absorbed Aldrich's actual words instead of Lyria's interpretations. Watched certainty become doubt, become something that might have been grudging respect. If this is accurate, the elderly man said finally, then Governor Lyria has been using us, using our legitimate claim to serve her own ambitions for power. She's planning to march on the Capitol with you as justification, Draven said, planning to present your claim as moral authority for regime change. Then once I'm removed, she'll position herself as Queen Regent, and you'll discover that restoration means answering to her instead of me. We're not fools, Kale said sharply. We wouldn't accept puppet status. You wouldn't have a choice. Once she controls the military and has the capital, you'd be exactly as dependent on her goodwill as you claim to be on mine. Except I'm offering genuine partnership. She's offering the illusion of restoration while maintaining real control herself. The room fell silent again. Longer this time. Draven could see them recalculating. Everything they'd believed about Lyria. Everything they'd planned based on her information and support. It was all fracturing in real time as they confronted the possibility they'd been manipulated. What do you propose? Kale asked finally. We stop Lyria together. We expose her conspiracy. And then we negotiate terms for Vial recognition and integration into governance that are genuine instead of symbolic. Draven looked around the table. You get justice, the Empire gets stability, and Lyria gets exactly what traitors deserve. It was a good pitch. Draven could feel momentum shifting, could see the Vale descendants considering it seriously instead of dismissing it outright. And then the doors burst open. Soldiers poured in, not Draven's guards, not Vale defenders. Fresh troops bearing Lyria's colors. 20 men, 30, more behind them. They surrounded the room in seconds, weapons drawn, cutting off every exit. And through the door walked Lyria herself. Draven's aunt looked exactly as he remembered. Tall, elegant, completely in control. She surveyed the room with satisfaction and smiled. Nephew, how kind of you to gather my enemies in one convenient location. This saves me considerable effort. Draven felt everything shift. The trap hadn't been Keth's crossing. The trap had been the entire negotiation. Lyria had let it happen. Had probably orchestrated the letter from the Vale descendants. Had brought him here specifically to eliminate both threats at once. Aunt Lyria, he said, keeping his voice level despite the rage building. I'm disappointed. I thought family betrayal would at least be creative. Oh, this is creative, trust me. Lyria moved into the room, her guards maintaining position. You think you've been so clever, sending spies east, planning your grand revelation of truth, positioning forces to cut my supply lines. She laughed. Draven, I've been planning this since before you took the throne. Every move you've made I've anticipated, every piece you've positioned I've countered. Then why let me get this far? Because I needed you to reveal yourself completely. Needed you to show the Empire that you're weak, that you care more about truth than power, that you'd negotiate with terrorists who claim your throne is stolen. She gestured at the Vale descendants. I needed you to prove you're unfit to rule, and you've done it beautifully. Cale Vale was staring at Lyria with something like horror. You told us you were helping restore our claim. I was helping. By using your claim to destabilize a king who was already destroying the Empire with his pathetic reforms. Lyria's voice was cold. You were always tools, useful ones, but tools nonetheless. Did you really think I'd hand you power after using you to seize it? The elderly Vale man stood abruptly. We had an agreement. We had an arrangement, and now it served its purpose. Lyria nodded to her guards. Arrest them. All of them. The Vale descendants, the false king. Anyone who resists dies. The soldiers moved forward. Draven's hand went to his sword, but there were too many and they were too close. Beside him, Kyle Vale drew her blade, but Lyria's men disarmed her before she could strike. Within seconds, the entire room was subdued. Draven on his knees with a sword at his throat. The Vale descendants likewise restrained. This was the trap. Not just physical, but complete. Lyria had maneuvered both sides of the conflict into one room and now held total control. What's your plan? Draven asked. Kill us here? Execute us publicly? Use us as hostages? Better. Lyria pulled a document from her coat. I'm going to make you sign this. It's your abdication. Complete surrender of the crown to me as regent until proper succession can be established. You'll confess that your reforms were disastrous, that you negotiated with terrorists, that you're unfit to rule, and then you'll quietly disappear while I restore order. And if I refuse, then I kill everyone in this room, starting with your precious advisor who's been rotting in my dungeons for the past week. Draven's blood turned to ice. Celine. Lyria smiled at his expression. Oh yes, the revolutionary you sent to spy on me. She's been very entertaining, stubborn, defiant, completely unwilling to give useful information. But I think seeing you broken will finally crack that spirit. She gestured. Guards dragged someone through the door. Celine. She looked worse than Draven had imagined. Bruised, bloody, one eye swollen shut. They'd kept her alive, but had made sure that survival was agonizing. She saw Draven, and something flickered in her expression. Not relief. Resignation. Like she'd known it would end this way. Hello, Your Majesty, she said. Her voice was hoarse but steady. Sorry I couldn't get out. Turns out your aunt's very thorough. Draven tried to stand. The sword at his throat pressed harder. Stay down, nephew. Lyria moved to Celine, grabbed her chin, forced her to look at Draven. This is what sentiment gets you. This is what happens when kings care about people instead of power. She released Celine roughly. Sign the abdication, and she lives. Refuse, and I kill her in front of you. Then kill the Vale descendants. Then march on the capital with your corpse as proof of your failure. You won't stop there, Draven said. You'll kill everyone who knows the truth, everyone who could challenge your claim. Eventually. But I'm offering you a choice. Die with honor defending nothing, or live knowing you chose power over principle when it actually mattered. It wasn't a real choice. Lyria knew he'd never sign, knew his entire transformation over the past month had been about choosing truth over expedience, knew that forcing him to choose between Celine's life and his integrity was a trap with no good escape. But she'd made one mistake. She'd assumed Draven was negotiating alone. And General Thane was exactly where he was supposed to be. Draven met Celine's eyes, saw understanding there, saw her nod fractionally. Then he looked at Lyria and smiled. "You're right about one thing, Aunt. I have been weak, sentimental, choosing truth over power like it matters. My father made the same mistake and it got him killed. But you taught me something important. What's that? That sentiment is only weakness if you let it be. If you let caring about people override strategy. But if you use it, if you let people think you're compromised while actually staying 3 steps ahead, then sentiment becomes the perfect disguise for ruthlessness." Lyria's smile faltered. "You think I came here unprepared?" Draven asked. "Think I rode into obvious trap without contingencies? While we've been talking, General Thane has surrounded this fortress and cut off every escape route. Your army in the east is isolated. Your supply lines are severed. And every noble house in the Empire has received sealed messages revealing your conspiracy. If I don't walk out of here alive, you become the most wanted traitor in Valoris history. You're bluffing. Test me, kill me, and find out if those messages were sent." Lyria's expression shifted. Doubt, anger, calculation. She hadn't expected this, hadn't prepared for the possibility that Draven had actually learned from his father's mistakes instead of just repeating them. The moment of hesitation was all Draven needed. He surged upward, grabbed the sword at his throat, twisted. The guard holding it stumbled. Draven wrenched the blade free and drove it into the soldier's chest in one motion. Beside him, Kael Vale had broken free from her restraints and seized a weapon. The other Vale descendants followed her lead. The room erupted into violence. Draven fought like he'd never fought before. Not with military precision, with desperate survival instinct. These were Lyria's elite guards, well-trained, well-armed. But they'd expected broken prisoners, not combatants who had nothing left to lose. Celine, still bound, threw herself at Lyria, knocked her off balance, bought Draven seconds to cut through another guard and reach his aunt. He grabbed Lyria's arm, twisted it behind her back, pressed his stolen blade to her throat. "Stop!" His voice cut through the chaos. "Everyone freezes or the governor dies." The fighting paused. Lyria's guards looked at their commander held hostage. The Vale descendants held their positions, and Draven pressed the blade harder against his aunt's skin. "Call them off," he said quietly. "Tell your men to stand down." Lyria laughed, hoarse and bitter. "You won't kill me. You're too weak, too sentimental. You couldn't even execute the revolutionary when you had the chance." "You're right. I am sentimental. That's why I'm giving you one chance to surrender before I prove sentiment doesn't mean mercy." The doors burst open again, but this time it was General Thane, with crowned soldiers, with reinforcements who'd been positioned exactly where Draven had planned. They poured into the fortress, overwhelming Lyria's guards, securing the room in seconds. Draven kept his blade at Lyria's throat, while Thane's men disarmed the remaining resistance. When the room was finally secured, Draven released his aunt, pushed her toward Thane's guards. She stumbled but caught herself, turning to face him with rage in her eyes. "You planned this," she said. "All of it. The negotiation, the trap. You knew I'd come. I knew you couldn't resist the opportunity to eliminate both threats at once. And I knew you'd underestimate me because you've spent 8 years assuming I'm just a brutal thug who can't think strategically." Draven lowered his sword. "You taught me that, Aunt. Taught me that everyone underestimates sentiment, uses it as evidence of weakness. So I let you think I was weak, let you believe I'd walk into your trap unprepared. And you fell for it because your contempt for who I'd become blinded you to what I was actually planning." Lyria's expression was pure hatred. "This isn't over. The Vael claim is still legitimate. The Empire still knows you're sitting on a stolen throne. You've won today, but you've lost the larger war." "Maybe." Draven turned to Kael Vael. "Or maybe we build something different." She looked at him warily. "Your claim is legitimate. My dynasty's claim is built on genocide. Those facts don't change. But maybe legitimacy matters less than what we do with power once we have it." "What are you proposing?" Kael asked. "Partnership. Full recognition of the Vael bloodline, seats on the council, authority over eastern provinces. Everything I offered before. Plus one more thing." Draven took a breath. "When I reveal the truth about the genocide publicly, you stand beside me. Help me build an empire where blood right matters less than results. Where the past is acknowledged but doesn't determine the future. And you keep the throne." I keep it until someone proves they can do better. Then I hand it over peacefully. That's the deal. No more stolen power, no more lies. Just governance based on competence and consent. Kale studied him. The other Vale descendants watched silently. Finally, the elderly man spoke. It's a better offer than we expected. Better than what Lyria promised, and then betrayed. If you're genuine, if you truly acknowledge the genocide and give us real power instead of symbolic gestures, we'll consider it. That's all I'm asking. Consideration. And a chance to prove I'm not my ancestors. Thane's guards had secured Lyria in chains. She looked small suddenly, diminished. All her careful planning and manipulation reduced to failure by the one factor she couldn't account for. That Draven had actually changed. Take her to the capital, Draven ordered. Hold her for trial. Charge her with treason, conspiracy, and the murder of my father. We'll let the evidence speak at public proceedings. You'll make me a martyr, Lyria spat. I'll make you an example of what happens when ambition overrides loyalty, when personal power matters more than the empire. Draven moved to where Celine sat, still bound. He cut her restraints carefully. She looked up at him with something that might have been relief, or might have been exhaustion, or might have been both. You came, she said quietly. Of course I came. You risked everything to get me intelligence. I wasn't leaving you behind, even knowing it might be a trap. Especially knowing it might be a trap. That's how this works now. We trust each other even when it's dangerous. Especially when it's dangerous. Celine smiled. Blood on her teeth, but genuine warmth in her eyes. Sentiment as strategy. I'm impressed. I learned from the best. They stood together while Thane organized prisoner transfer, and the Vale descendants conferred quietly about whether to accept Draven's offer. The fortress that had been meant as the site of Draven's downfall had become the place where everything changed, but it wasn't over. Lyria was right about that. The truth would still come out. The empire would still fracture when people learned the Kael dynasty was built on genocide. Draven would still have to stand before millions and admit his claim was illegitimate. The difference was now he'd do it with allies instead of alone, with the Vael descendants beside him instead of against him. With Celene's intelligence and Thane's military support and the hope, fragile and unlikely but real, that truth might actually matter more than bloodright. If it worked, they'd build something new, something better. If it failed, at least they'd fail honestly. And for the first time in 8 years, Draven found he could live with that uncertainty, could accept that some outcomes were beyond control, and all he could do was make the best choices available and hope they were enough. He looked at Celine, at Kael Vile, at the future that was rushing toward them, whether they were ready or not. Then he gave the order to ride back to the capital. The real fight was just beginning. The ride back to the capital took 4 days that felt like 4 years. Draven led the column with Celine at his side and General Thane commanding the rear guard, where Lyria rode in chains. The Vale descendants traveled separately but parallel, maintaining distance that suggested alliance without trust. Smart. Draven would have done the same. Every mile closer to the capital brought new intelligence, couriers intercepted, messages decoded. The picture that emerged made Draven's earlier concerns look naive. Lyria's conspiracy wasn't limited to the eastern provinces. She had supporters throughout the empire. Noble houses who'd benefited from her governance and feared the reforms. Military officers who preferred the old brutal efficiency to Draven's attempts at legitimacy through results. Merchants whose profits depended on the corruption Draven was trying to eliminate. The network was massive, coordinated, and now leaderless with Lyria captured, which made it more dangerous instead of less. Desperate conspirators did unpredictable things. General Thane brought the latest report on the second night. They'd camped in rough territory, defensive positions in case Lyria's remaining forces tried rescue. Draven stood near the command tent studying maps while exhaustion pulled at his bones. Your Majesty. Thane's voice was grim. We've intercepted communications from the capital. Elements of the city garrison are preparing to resist your return. They're calling Lyria's arrest illegal, claiming you've been compromised by the Vale descendants. How many? 3 battalions? Maybe 4. That's 2,000 troops inside the capital walls who might turn hostile the moment we arrive. And loyal forces? General Thane hesitated. Hard to say. Some battalions are solid, Others are waiting to see which way this falls before declaring allegiance. If we enter the capital and it turns into street fighting, we could lose half the city before securing victory. Then, we don't fight in the streets. Draven traced routes on the map. We go straight to the palace, secure the throne room and council chambers. Make it clear I'm still in command. That requires getting through potentially hostile gates with an army that might fracture the moment we're inside walls. It's a risk, Your Majesty. Everything about this situation is a risk. At least this way we control the confrontation. Celine approached from the shadows. She moved stiffly, injuries from Lyria's dungeon still healing, but her mind was sharp as ever. She'd been quiet since Keth's crossing, processing, planning. Now she joined the War Council without invitation, and Draven didn't stop her. You can't just ride in with military force, she said. That's exactly what Lyria's supporters want. Proof that you're a tyrant crushing dissent. You need to be smarter than that. What do you suggest? Thane asked. His tone suggested he didn't particularly value her input, but was too professional to say so directly. He needs to address the people first, before entering the capital, before the garrison can frame this as a military coup. Celine moved to the map. There's high ground 3 miles from the main gates. Overlooks the trade roads. If you position there and send word that the king will make a public address, people will come. They always do when power shifts. And say what? Draven asked. That my throne is stolen and I'm keeping it anyway? That my aunt tried to kill me and I'm arresting her for it? Every word will be used against me by someone. So you make it impossible to twist. You tell the complete truth. All of it. The genocide, the lies, Lyria's conspiracy, the veil claim, everything. Celine met his eyes. You strip away every layer of deception and let people decide based on reality instead of propaganda. It's the only move they won't expect because no king in history has been honest enough to try it. It could trigger immediate rebellion. It could. Or it could buy you legitimacy that fear and bloodright never provided. People respect honesty even when it's ugly, especially when it's ugly. You've spent weeks preparing for this moment. Don't lose your nerve now. Draven looked at the map. At the high ground Celine had indicated. At the roads that would fill with citizens if word spread that the king had something important to say. It was insane, reckless. The kind of gamble that either changed everything or destroyed it completely. Exactly the kind of move his father would have made if he'd lived long enough to try. We do it, Draven said. Tomorrow morning, before the garrison can organize resistance. We position on the high ground, and I tell them everything. Thane looked pained, but nodded. I'll arrange security, and prepare contingencies for if this goes poorly. It's definitely going poorly, Draven said. Question is whether we control the chaos, or let it control us. They broke camp before dawn. The column moved through darkness toward the capital, toward the confrontation that would determine whether Draven's gamble on truth had been genius or suicide. As the sun rose, they reached the high ground Celine had identified, a natural amphitheater where sound would carry and crowds could gather. Thane positioned troops defensively, not threatening, just present, a reminder that Draven still commanded military force even if he was about to admit his moral authority was questionable. Couriers rode to the capital with word that King Draven Kyle would address the Empire at noon, that all citizens were invited, that the future of Valoris would be decided today. By mid-morning, people had started arriving. They came from the capital and surrounding territories, merchants and workers and nobles and soldiers whose loyalty was uncertain. They came because power was shifting and everyone wanted to witness it, wanted to know which way to fall when the Empire fractured. Draven watched them gather and felt something close to terror. These were his people. The citizens he'd spent 8 years ruling through fear and the past month trying to serve through reform. They had no idea what he was about to tell them, no preparation for the revelation that their entire history was built on lies. And he was going to shatter that foundation because it was the only honest path forward. Celine stood beside him. She'd cleaned up as much as possible, but the bruises on her face were still visible. Evidence of what Lyria had done. What happened to people who challenged the power structure? You don't have to do this, she said quietly. You could still turn back. Arrest Lyria quietly. Suppress the veil claim. Rule the way you always have. And prove Lyria right, that I'm too weak to face truth. That sentiment compromised my judgment. Draven shook his head. No. We're past the point where hiding works. The only way forward is through complete honesty. Even if it destroys you, especially if it destroys me, because then at least the Empire gets truth, gets a chance to build something better than what my ancestors created. Celine took his hand, squeezed once. You're either the bravest king I've ever heard of, or the most foolish. Probably both. By noon, thousands had gathered. The natural amphitheater was packed with humanity, faces turned upward, waiting, expecting some dramatic announcement of victory or crisis. Draven walked to the edge of the high ground where everyone could see him. No crown, no ceremonial armor, just a king in travel-stained clothes standing before his people without pretense or performance. The crowd fell silent. Draven drew breath and began. I'm going to tell you something that will change how you see this empire, how you see the Kyle dynasty, how you see me. And when I'm finished, you'll have a choice to make about what happens next. His voice carried across the amphitheater. Thousands of eyes fixed on him. 300 years ago, my ancestor Aldrich I united the warring clans and established the Kyle dynasty. This is the story every child learns, the official history, but it's incomplete, and the parts that were left out matter more than anything we've been taught. Draven felt the weight of every gaze, every expectation, every assumption about to be shattered. There was a 13th clan, the Vale clan. They were the largest and most powerful. They held legitimate claim to rule by ancient blood right. And my ancestor didn't defeat them honorably. He murdered them, every man, woman, and child, burned their holdings, destroyed their records, and then rewrote history to erase any evidence they'd ever existed. The silence was so complete, Draven could hear wind moving through grass. The Kyle dynasty is built on genocide, on stolen legitimacy, on a lie so complete that 300 years later, most of you are hearing about the Vale clan for the first time. Everything I've told you about our right to rule, everything you've been taught about why the Kyle family deserves the throne, is false. Movement in the crowd, whispers starting, shock spreading like ripples in water. My father discovered this truth 8 years ago. He tried to address it quietly, tried to negotiate with the Vale survivors who'd escaped the genocide, and he was murdered for it, not by his brother like the official story claims, by someone in our own family who wanted the truth buried. Draven gestured, and guards brought Lyria forward. She stood in chains, defiant even in captivity. Governor Lyria Kale has been conspiring for years to use the Vale claim against me. She killed my father. She manipulated the Vale descendants. And she planned to seize the throne by presenting herself as the solution to instability she herself created. Not because she cared about justice for the Vale people, because she wanted power and was willing to use historical atrocity as a weapon to get it. The crowd was no longer silent. Voices rose, questions, accusations, denial and belief warring across thousands of faces. Draven raised his hand. The noise subsided slightly. I'm telling you this because you deserve truth, because ruling through lies makes me exactly the kind of tyrant my ancestor was, and because the Vile descendants deserve acknowledgement of what was done to their people. He gestured, and Kael Vile stepped forward. She looked uncomfortable being displayed like this, but held her ground, stood beside Draven as living proof that the Vale bloodline had survived. This is Kyle Vale, descendant of the clan my ancestor tried to erase. She has every right to hate me, every justification for wanting the throne returned to her bloodline. And I'm not going to argue with that claim. It's legitimate. The crowd erupted, shouts of disbelief, anger, confusion. Thane's soldiers tensed but held position. This was the moment of maximum danger, when truth hit like physical force and people had to decide what to do with it. Draven waited for the noise to subside. When it didn't, he shouted over it. But legitimacy by blood right isn't the only kind that matters. His voice cut through the chaos. People quieted to hear. Yes, the throne was stolen. Yes, my family built power on genocide. Those facts don't change. But what I can change is what the empire becomes from this point forward, whether we perpetuate the cycles of violence and deception, or whether we build something better. He looked out across the thousands of faces, saw fear and anger and uncertainty, saw everything he felt reflected back at him. I'm not asking you to forget what my ancestor did. I'm asking you to judge me on what I do, on whether the reforms I've implemented actually improve your lives, on whether governance by competence matters more than governance by bloodline. The empire my ancestor built was founded on lies. The empire I'm trying to build will be founded on results. And if I fail, If I can't prove I've earned this throne through effective rule, then the Vale descendants have every right to challenge me, and I'll step down peacefully because power that can't be justified shouldn't be maintained. The crowd was processing. Draven could see it happening in real time, the mental adjustment from assumed legitimacy to revealed fraud, the recalculation of whether they owed loyalty to a throne built on genocide. And underneath that processing, he could see the deeper question forming, the one that would determine everything. Did honesty matter? Did truth actually count for something? Or was power just power regardless of how it was obtained? A voice shouted from the crowd, an older man, scarred and rough. If the throne is stolen, why should we let you keep it? Why not give it to the people who actually deserve it? Because deserving and ruling aren't the same thing, Draven answered. The Vale descendants deserve acknowledgement, compensation, authority, a voice in governance. But handing them total power doesn't serve the empire. It just replaces one dynasty with another. What serves the empire is building a system where leadership is earned through results instead of inherited through blood. Pretty words from a king trying to keep his crown, someone else shouted. You're right, they are pretty words. And I could be lying. Could be manipulating you the same way my family has for 300 years. Draven spread his hands. But here's the difference. I'm giving you the information to make your own choice. Telling you the throne is stolen, admitting my claim is built on genocide. If I wanted to manipulate you, I'd keep lying, keep pretending the official history is complete. Instead, I'm giving you truth and asking you to decide what matters more. Blood right from 3 centuries ago, or governance that actually works today. The questions kept coming. Angry ones, skeptical ones, a few that suggested people were actually considering his argument. Draven answered them all. No deflection, no political smoothing, just direct responses to direct challenges. And slowly, impossibly, he felt the crowd's energy shift, not to acceptance, but to consideration, to the possibility that maybe truth actually did count for something, that maybe a king willing to admit his illegitimacy and still argue he'd earned the throne through results was different from the tyrants who'd ruled through fear and lies. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky. And Draven stood on that high ground answering questions until his voice was hoarse and his legs shook from exhaustion. Finally, Kael Vael spoke. Her voice carried across the amphitheater like a blade cutting through confusion. The Kael dynasty murdered my ancestors, stole what was rightfully ours, spent 300 years erasing evidence we existed. Every word King Draven just told you is true, and I have documentation to prove it. The crowd tensed. This was it. The moment where the Vale claim would be presented as superior to Draven's governance argument. But Kael didn't finish the way Draven expected. And despite all that, she continued, King Draven is offering something my people haven't had in 3 centuries. Acknowledgement, recognition, real power in governance instead of symbolic gestures. He's admitting crimes most kings would deny. He's giving up the moral high ground to build something based on honesty. She looked at Draven, not warmly, but with something that might have been respect. I don't forgive what his ancestor did. I never will. But I'm willing to work with a king who admits the genocide instead of fighting one who denies it, because vengeance that destroys the empire serves no one. Justice that acknowledges the past while building a better future? That's worth considering. The crowd erupted again, but this time the energy was different. Not just shock and anger, actual debate. People arguing with each other about legitimacy and results, and whether 300-year-old crimes should determine current governance. Draven had cracked the foundation. Now he had to hope the empire didn't collapse before they could rebuild it. Movement at the edge of the crowd. Guards rushing toward Thane. The general listened, his face darkening, then moved quickly to Draven's side. Your Majesty, we have a problem. The garrison in the capital has mobilized. They're marching this way with heavy weapons. Estimate 2,000 troops approaching fast. Lyria's supporters making their move. Draven looked at the crowd, at thousands of civilians caught between opposing forces. If fighting started here, the casualties would be catastrophic. Everyone who isn't military needs to leave. Now. This is about to become a battlefield. The crowd hesitated. Some people ran immediately. Others stood frozen, unwilling to miss whatever happened next. Thane's soldiers started directing civilians away from the high ground, creating corridors for escape. And from the south, Draven could see dust rising. The approaching garrison, 2,000 troops loyal to the old ways, to Lyria, to the idea that Draven's reforms and honesty had made him weak enough to challenge. General Thane moved beside him, hand on sword. "Orders, Your Majesty?" Draven looked at his forces. Maybe 800 loyal troops. Good soldiers, but outnumbered. And between them and the approaching garrison, hundreds of civilians still evacuating. If they fought here, the carnage would be immense. Blood soaking into the same ground where he'd just promised to build something better than his ancestors' violence. But if he retreated, he'd prove Lyria's supporters right, would confirm that honesty made him weak, would lose the momentum from the speech that had finally started shifting public opinion. There was no good option, just terrible ones and worse ones. "We hold this ground," Draven said. "We make them attack civilians if they want to reach us. Make them prove they care more about killing me than protecting the people they claim to serve. That's a gamble, Your Majesty." "Everything about today has been a gamble." Draven drew his sword. "At least this way we're gambling on their humanity instead of their loyalty." The approaching troops became visible, a disciplined column bearing Lyria's colors alongside the crown insignia, a visual statement that they were fighting for the true empire against a compromised king. At their head rode a commander Draven recognized, General Malrek's son, a young officer who'd watched his father get arrested for conspiracy and apparently decided to finish what Malrek started. The column stopped 300 yards out, close enough to intimidate, far enough to assess the situation, civilians still scattered between the forces. Draven's troops positioned defensively on high ground. Young Malrek rode forward alone, stopped 50 feet from where Draven stood, his voice carried across the distance. "King Draven, stand down. Surrender yourself for trial on charges of consorting with enemies of the Empire and delegitimizing the crown through false admissions of historical crimes." "The charges are accurate," Draven called back. "I did consort with Veil descendants. I did admit historical crimes, because both those things are necessary to save this empire from tearing itself apart. You've weakened us beyond recovery, made us look illegitimate to every foreign power and internal challenger. Your father would be ashamed. My father would be proud. I'm finally telling the truth. He died trying to reveal." Draven moved to the edge of the high ground where young Malrek could see him clearly. "Your father died in chains because he chose personal ambition over the Empire. Don't make the same mistake. My father died because you've lost the strength to rule, because you let a common revolutionary poison your judgment, because you care more about appearing moral than maintaining power." The words hit exactly where young Malrek intended, because they contained truth that Draven couldn't deny. He had changed, had let Selene influence his thinking, had chosen honesty over the brutal efficiency that had kept the Empire stable for 8 years. But that change was the point. The old way was dying. The question was whether they'd build something new or just burn it all down. "If you attack," Draven said, "you'll kill civilians. You'll prove you care more about power than the people you claim to serve. And history will remember you as the general who massacred innocents to maintain a throne built on lies. History will remember me as the general who saved the empire from a weak king. Then come and save it. But know that every person who dies today dies because you chose violence over dialogue, because you couldn't imagine a world where honesty matters more than force." Young Malrek wheeled his horse, returned to his troops. Draven watched him confer with his officers, saw them looking at the civilians still evacuating, at the defensive positions Thane had established, at the terrible optics of attacking through crowds to reach a king who just admitted his own illegitimacy. For a moment, Draven thought it might work, thought young Malrek might decide the cost was too high. Then the troops started moving forward, not charging, advancing slowly and deliberately, pushing through the remaining civilians, herding them aside without killing them, but making clear that nothing would stop this attack. Thane barked orders. Draven's soldiers formed shield walls. Archers took position, the classic defensive formation against superior numbers. And in the space between armies, the last civilians ran. Mothers grabbing children, old men stumbling on rough ground, everyone desperate to escape the violence about to erupt. Draven felt time slow down, felt every heartbeat distinct and separate, felt the weight of every decision that had led to this moment, the execution he'd postponed, the truth he'd revealed, the gamble that honesty could replace fear as the foundation of governance, all of it coming down to this. Blood on ground he'd promised to transform, Beside him, Celine had acquired a blade from somewhere. She held it unpracticed but determined, ready to fight despite injuries that hadn't fully healed. "You don't have to do this," Draven said quietly. "You could leave. This isn't your battle. Everything about this is my battle. I called you a hollow king because you ruled through fear. Now you're trying to rule through truth, and they're killing you for it." She adjusted her grip on the sword. "If I run now, I prove that truth doesn't matter, that only force wins. We might lose. Probably. But we'll lose honestly. That counts for something." Draven wanted to argue, wanted to order her to safety, but there was no safety. Not anymore. The Empire was fracturing in real time, and everyone had to choose which side of the break they'd stand on. He chose truth. She chose truth. And if that got them both killed, at least they'd die for something real instead of another generation of lies. Young Malrek's forces reached firing range. Arrows flew. Draven's troops raised shields. The distinctive sound of arrowheads hitting wood echoed across the high ground. Then the real fighting started. The garrison troops hit Draven's shield wall like a hammer blow. The defensive line held but buckled. Soldiers grunted and strained and died. Blood soaked into earth that had been peaceful hours earlier when Draven stood here and promised to build something better. He fought because standing back would be cowardice. Fought beside soldiers who'd stayed loyal despite having every reason to switch sides. Fought with the desperate intensity of someone who knew this battle determined more than military victory. This was the test. Whether truth could actually stand against force, whether honesty had any practical value, or if power would always belong to whoever was willing to be most ruthless. Draven blocked a sword thrust, countered, felt his blade bite into armor. The man fell and another took his place. The fighting was chaos. No grand strategy, just survival measured in seconds. Somewhere nearby, Celine fought with untrained fury. She had no technique, but she had rage. Rage at Lyria's torture. Rage at an empire that had tried to kill her for speaking truth. Rage at a world where honesty was punished and lies were rewarded. Draven saw her take a cut across her shoulder, saw her stumble but stay upright, wanted to reach her but couldn't break formation without collapsing the entire defensive line. The garrison forces kept coming, waves of them, more than Thane's intelligence had suggested. Either young Malrek had reinforcements, or half the capital garrison had joined the attack. Draven's forces were being overwhelmed. Slowly, inevitably. The math was simple and brutal. 800 against 2,000 only ended one way. And then horns sounded from the north. Different horns. Not military signals. Something older. Tribal calls from before the Empire existed. Through the dust and chaos, Draven saw new forces arriving. Not organized troops, armed civilians, workers from the factories, merchants who'd benefited from the reforms. People from the lower districts who'd heard Draven's speech and decided truth was worth fighting for. They weren't trained, weren't equipped, but they were hundreds strong, and they hit the garrison's flank with fury that had nothing to do with military discipline and everything to do with rage at being lied to for generations. The garrison troops faltered, caught between Draven's soldiers and an armed mob. Young Malrek tried to rally his forces, but the momentum had shifted, and then the Vael descendants joined the fight. Kyle Vale led 50 warriors down from where they'd been positioned as observers. They could have stayed out of it, could have let Draven's supporters and the garrison destroy each other. Instead, they chose a side. They chose truth. The battle turned, not easily, not without more blood, but turned nonetheless. The garrison forces realized they were surrounded by enemies on all sides and facing civilians willing to die for a king who'd admitted his throne was stolen. Young Malrek made the smart choice, called retreat. His troops pulled back in disciplined formation, leaving their dead but taking their wounded. A fighting withdrawal that preserved strength while acknowledging they'd lost this engagement. Draven let them go. Could have pursued. Could have turned withdrawal into rout. But killing soldiers who genuinely believed they were serving the Empire wouldn't prove anything except that he could be as brutal as his ancestors. As the garrison disappeared toward the capital, Draven stood among the carnage and tried to process what had just happened. They'd won, not through superior force or better strategy, through civilians deciding that truth mattered enough to fight for it, through the Vael descendants choosing alliance over vengeance, through people who had every reason to hate Draven deciding that honesty was worth more than perfect legitimacy. General Thane appeared, bleeding from a dozen minor wounds. Your Majesty, we need to secure the capital before they regroup. Draven looked at his exhausted forces. At the civilians who'd fought beside them, many now realizing they'd just committed to treason if this all went wrong. At the Vale warriors who'd chosen to support a Kael king despite 300 years of genocide. We go to the capital, he agreed. But not to conquer, to govern. There's a difference. The march to the capital happened in silence. Too much death, too much chaos. Everyone processing what they'd just survived. The gates were closed when they arrived, locked from inside by whoever controlled the garrison. A statement that Draven's victory at the high ground didn't translate to control of the city. Draven stood before the massive gates and felt exhaustion threaten to pull him down. He'd revealed the truth, survived assassination, won a battle against superior numbers, and now faced locked gates that might as well have been walls for all his ability to get through them without siege. Celine moved beside him. Her shoulder was bandaged, but she stood steady. The wound hadn't been as deep as it looked. "What now?" she asked quietly. "Now we find out if honesty actually matters to the people inside these walls." Draven raised his voice to Carrie. "I am King Draven Kael. I've just defeated forces loyal to a conspiracy that killed my father and tried to destroy this empire. Open the gates, or I'll assume everyone inside is complicit in treason and act accordingly." Silence from the walls. Then a voice called down. A familiar voice. "Lord Corvin, Your Majesty, the city is divided. Half the garrison supports you. Half supports the old guard. If you force entry, we'll have street fighting that could kill thousands." "Then what do you suggest?" Draven shouted back. A pause. Then Corvin spoke again. "Trial by council. You present your evidence of Lyria's conspiracy before the full court. The Vale descendants present their historical claim. We debate publicly, and the noble houses vote on who has legitimate authority to rule. No more fighting, just political process. It was a trap. Draven knew it instantly. The noble houses were split. Many of them had benefited from Lyria's governance. A vote could go either way, and if he lost, he'd have legitimized his own removal from power. But refusing would prove he didn't trust democratic process, would confirm every accusation that he ruled through force instead of consent. Celine leaned close. "It's a trap." "I know. You'll walk into that council chamber and they'll destroy you politically. Everything you've built, all the reforms, all the honesty. They'll vote it away and install someone who'll go back to the old ways." "Probably. So why are you considering it?" "Because the alternative is battering down these gates and conquering my own capital. Becoming exactly the tyrant I've spent a month trying to stop being." Draven looked at her. "You told me sentiment could be strength if I used it strategically. This is the strategy. Trust that truth and results matter more than political maneuvering. And if they don't, then I lose. But I lose honestly. And maybe that matters more than winning through force." Celine shook her head. "You're going to get yourself killed. Maybe. Or maybe I'm going to prove that governance can be about more than who's willing to be most brutal." Draven turned back to the gates, shouted up to Corvin. "I accept. Trial by council, tomorrow at dawn. Full transparency. All evidence presented publicly." Corvin's voice carried relief. "The gates will open for you, Your Majesty. Under truce. No weapons in the council chamber. No guards except ceremonial honor units.